Dr. Emily Carter had been working at St. Mary's Hospital for over a decade. The night shifts were usually quiet, with only a few emergencies trickling in. But there was one part of the hospital she always avoided: the old, abandoned ward on the top floor. Rumors among the staff spoke of strange occurrences and ghostly apparitions, but Emily had always dismissed them as mere superstitions. One stormy night, the hospital was unusually busy. A severe thunderstorm had caused multiple accidents, and the emergency room was overflowing with patients. Emily was tending to a particularly difficult case when a nurse rushed up to her. "Dr. Carter, we're out of beds. We need to use the old ward," the nurse said, her voice trembling. Emily hesitated. The old ward had been closed for years due to structural issues and was rumored to be haunted. But with nowhere else to go, she had no choice. She grabbed a flashlight and headed up to the top floor, the nurse trailing nervously behind her. The elevator ride seemed to take forever, the old machinery groaning with every floor they passed. When the doors finally opened, they were greeted by a long, dark hallway. The air was thick with dust, and the only sound was the distant rumble of thunder. Emily's flashlight cut through the darkness as she made her way down the hallway. The walls were lined with old medical equipment, covered in cobwebs and decay. She reached the nurse's station and flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. The power was out. "We'll have to manage with just the flashlights," Emily said, trying to sound confident. They set up a few makeshift beds for the overflow patients, and Emily began her rounds. As she checked on each patient, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Shadows seemed to dance just out of the corner of her eye, and the temperature dropped sharply. At around 2 a.m., Emily heard a faint whispering sound. She stopped and listened, but the noise faded away. She continued her rounds, but the whispering grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the far end of the ward, near the old operating rooms. "Stay here," Emily told the nurse. "I'm going to check it out." The nurse nodded, her face pale with fear. Emily made her way down the hallway, the whispering growing louder with each step. She reached the door to the operating room and pushed it open. Inside, the room was cold and dark, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and decay. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Emily shone her flashlight around the room, but it revealed nothing out of the ordinary. She turned to leave when she heard a faint moan. "Hello," she called out. "Is someone there?" The moaning grew louder, and Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She followed the sound to a large, metal cabinet in the corner of the room. Taking a deep breath, she opened the cabinet. Inside, she found a young woman, her clothes torn and covered in blood. Her eyes were wide with terror, and she was whispering frantically. "Help me, please help me." Emily knelt down beside her. "It's okay, you're safe now. What happened?" The woman shook her head, tears streaming down her face. He's coming back. You have to hide." "Who?" Emily asked, but before the woman could answer, the door slammed shut behind her. Emily spun around, her flashlight beam dancing wildly across the room. The temperature plummeted, and she could see her breath in the air. The whispering started again, louder and more frantic. "Who's there?" Emily demanded, but there was no response. The room grew darker, the flashlight flickering as if struggling to stay alive. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in an old-fashioned surgeon's uniform. His eyes were hollow, and his smile twisted into something malevolent. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a low growl. Emily backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. "Who are you?" The figure stepped closer, his presence filling the room with a sense of dread. "This is my domain. You have no right to be here." Emily tried to move, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. The figure raised a hand, and the young woman screamed. The sound broke Emily's paralysis, and she grabbed the woman, pulling her to her feet. "Run!" Emily shouted, and they bolted for the door. They ran down the hallway, the whispering following them like a swarm of angry bees. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to reach out for them. They burst through the door to the ward, slamming it shut behind them. The nurse looked up, her eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" "No time to explain," Emily panted. "We need to get out of here." They gathered the patients as quickly as they could, moving them back down to the main floors of the hospital. As they descended in the elevator, the whispering finally faded, replaced by the familiar sounds of the bustling hospital. Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She glanced at the young woman, who was now being tended to by the other staff. "Who is he?" she asked softly. The woman looked up, her eyes still filled with terror. "Dr. Morgan. He was a surgeon here a long time ago. He experimented on his patients, doing unspeakable things. When they found out, he disappeared. But his spirit, it never left." Emily shuddered. The memory of Dr. Morgan's hollow eyes burned into her mind. From that night on, she made sure that no one ventured into the old ward again. The hospital resumed its normal operations, but the staff whispered of the night when the past came back to haunt them. And in the dark, forgotten corners of St. Mary's Hospital, the spirit of Dr. Morgan still lurked, waiting for the next soul to wander into his domain. Greenfield High School had been around for nearly a century. Its grand, imposing structure stood as a testament to the town's history, with its tall, arched windows and weathered bricks. Over the years, the school had seen countless students pass through its halls, but it also held dark secrets that few spoke about. One cold autumn evening, a group of students, Mike, Jenny, Sam, and Lisa, decided to stay after hours to finish their group project. The school was empty, the echo of their footsteps the only sound in the hallways. They gathered in the library, a vast room filled with towering shelves of old books and dusty relics. As they worked, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room. The overhead lights flickered, casting an eerie glow over their workspace. "Did you hear about the old science lab?" Sam asked, breaking the silence. Mike rolled his eyes. "Not this again. Every school has ghost stories." "No, seriously," Sam insisted. "They say the old science lab on the third floor is haunted. Back in the 1930s, a student died there during a failed experiment. They say his spirit still roams the halls." Jenny shivered. "Can we not talk about ghosts? We're here alone, remember?" Lisa laughed. "Come on, guys. We're almost done. Let's focus." They worked for another hour, but the unease lingered. Eventually, curiosity got the better of them. "Why don't we check it out?" Mike suggested. "Just a quick look. We're already here." Jenny protested, but the others were intrigued. They packed up their things and made their way to the third floor. The hallway was dimly lit, the air colder than it had been on the lower levels. They found the old science lab at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and a chill ran down Jenny's spine. Mike pushed the door open, and they stepped inside. The lab was frozen in time, untouched since the 1930s. Dust-covered beakers and flasks lined the counters, and an old blackboard still bore faint chalk marks. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals and decay. "This is creepy," Lisa whispered. "Let's just look around and leave." As they explored the lab, a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut. Jenny screamed, and the others spun around, hearts pounding. "Calm down," Mike said, though his voice trembled. "It's just the wind." But as they tried to open the door, they realized it was locked from the outside. Panic set in. "Who locked us in?" Sam demanded. banging on the door. A soft, ghostly whisper filled the room. "You shouldn't be here." The students froze, looking around in terror. The lights flickered, and in the dim light, they saw a shadowy figure standing at the far end of the room. It was a young man, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, his eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. "Please let us go," Jenny pleaded, tears streaming down her face. The figure moved closer, and the air grew colder. "You disturbed my rest," he said in a voice that echoed through the room. "Now you must stay." Desperate, Mike searched the room for another way out. He found a small window high up on the wall. "Help me move this table," he said. "We can climb out." They scrambled to move the table and stacked chairs on top of it. One by one, they climbed through the window, the ghosts' mournful cries following them. As they dropped to the ground outside, they ran as fast as they could, not stopping until they were far from the school. They collapsed on the sidewalk, gasping for breath. "What was that?" Sam asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Mike replied, "but we're never going back there." The next day, they told their friends what had happened, but few believed them. The old science lab was sealed off, and no one dared to venture near it again. From that night on, the students of Greenfield high avoided the third floor. Whispers of the ghostly figure spread, but the old lab remained undisturbed. And in the dark corners of the school, the spirit of the young man lingered, waiting for the next group of curious souls to disturb his eternal rest. Lucy had always loved her cozy, old house nestled on the outskirts of town. The house had character, with its creaky wooden floors, vintage furniture, and the warmth of countless memories embedded in its walls. She found comfort in its familiar surroundings, especially on nights when she was alone. One evening, after a long day at work, Lucy decided to unwind with a good book and a cup of tea. The wind howled outside, and the autumn leaves rustled against the windows. She wrapped herself in a soft blanket and settled into her favorite armchair in the living room. The crackling fireplace cast flickering shadows on the walls, adding to the house's warm ambience. As she read, the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times, breaking the peaceful silence. Lucy glanced up, realizing how late it was. She set her book down and decided to lock up for the night. She walked through the house, checking the front door, back door, and windows, ensuring everything was secure. Returning to the living room, she noticed something odd. The blanket she had left on the couch was now on the floor. She frowned, thinking she must have knocked it off without realizing it. She picked it up and placed it back on the couch. Suddenly, she heard a faint creaking sound coming from upstairs. Her heart skipped a beat. Lucy lived alone, and no one else was supposed to be in the house. She stood still, listening intently. The creaking continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking down the hallway above her. Grabbing her phone, Lucy dialed her friend Rachel's number. The phone rang twice before Rachel picked up. "Hey, Lucy. What's up?" "Rachel, I think someone is in my house," Lucy whispered, her voice trembling. "Are you sure?" "Maybe it's just the house settling," Rachel suggested, trying to be reassuring. "I don't know. It sounds like footsteps. I'm really scared." "Okay, stay calm. Do you want me to come over?" Before Lucy could respond, the creaking stopped. A chilling silence followed, and Lucy's heart pounded in her chest. She whispered into the phone, I think they stopped." "Stay on the line with me," Rachel urged. "Go to a room where you can lock the door and call the police." Lucy nodded, even though Rachel couldn't see her. She quietly moved toward the kitchen, where she knew there was a sturdy door. As she entered the kitchen, she felt a cold draft brush against her skin. The back door, which she had checked and locked earlier, was now slightly ajar. "Rachel, the back door is open," Lucy said, her voice shaking. "Get out of there, Lucy. Now." Lucy ran to the back door, intending to flee, but as she reached for the handle, she felt a presence behind her. She spun around, her eyes wide with fear. Standing in the doorway was a tall, shadowy figure, barely visible in the dim light. Lucy screamed and bolted through the back door, sprinting into the yard. She didn't stop until she reached her neighbor's house. Banging on the door frantically, she prayed they were home. Moments later, the door opened and her neighbor, Mr. Thompson, stood there, looking concerned. "Lucy, what's wrong?" "Someone's in my house," she gasped out of breath. Mr. Thompson grabbed a baseball bat and led Lucy inside, calling the police as they went. They waited anxiously for the authorities to arrive, every second feeling like an eternity. When the police finally came, they searched Lucy's house thoroughly but found no signs of an intruder. The back door showed no signs of forced entry, and nothing appeared to be stolen or disturbed. The only thing out of place was the blanket on the floor and the lingering sense of dread that hung in the air. The officers advised Lucy to stay with a friend for the night and assured her they would keep an eye on the neighborhood. Rachel arrived soon after, and Lucy packed a bag, too shaken to stay another night in her beloved home. As they drove away, Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She glanced back at the house, its dark windows staring back like empty eyes. She hoped it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew that something or someone had been in her house that night. For weeks, Lucy stayed with Rachel, unable to face the solitude of her own home. When she finally returned, she installed new locks, security cameras, and an alarm system. But the sense of safety she once felt in her cozy house was forever shattered. Late at night, when the wind howled and the shadows danced on the walls, Lucy couldn't help but wonder if the intruder would return. And every creak and whisper in the darkness reminded her that she was never truly alone. Every year, a group of friends, Ethan, Sarah, Mark, and Laura, set out on an adventurous camping trip to explore new, remote locations. This year, they chose Whispering Pines, a secluded forest known for its dense trees and serene lakes. They had heard rumors about the forest, tales of hikers who went missing and whispers of spirits that roamed the woods at night, but they brushed them off as mere legends. They arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows through the towering pines. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. They quickly set up their tents and gathered around the campfire, eager to unwind and share stories. As night fell, the forest grew eerily quiet. The friends sat close to the fire, its flickering light casting ghostly shadows on their faces. Mark, always the storyteller, began recounting the legend of the Whispering Pines. "Legend has it," Mark said, his voice low and dramatic, "that a group of settlers disappeared in these woods over a century ago. They say that at night, you can hear their whispers, calling out for help, trying to lure the living into the forest." Laura rolled her eyes. "Come on, Mark, we're not kids. Save the ghost stories for Halloween." But Ethan and Sarah listened intently, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and fascination. After the story, they decided to call it a night. As they crawled into their tents, a chilling breeze swept through the campsite. Ethan, unable to sleep, lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest. Suddenly, he heard a faint whisper, so soft he almost thought he imagined it. "Help us, please." Ethan's heart pounded. He sat up, straining to hear more. The whispering grew louder, seemingly coming from the depths of the forest. He unzipped his tent and stepped out, looking around nervously. The fire had died down, and the campsite was shrouded in darkness. "Ethan, what are you doing?" Sarah's voice startled him. She had also emerged from her tent, looking worried. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah listened and nodded slowly. It sounds like voices. Curiosity getting the better of them, they decided to investigate. Grabbing flashlights, they ventured into the woods, the beams of light cutting through the inky blackness. The whispering grew louder, guiding them deeper into the forest. "Help us, we're lost." The voices seemed to come from all around them, echoing through the trees. Sarah shivered, clutching Ethan's arm. "This doesn't feel right, Ethan. Maybe we should go back." But Ethan was determined. What if someone really needs help? We can't just ignore it. They pressed on, the forest growing denser and more oppressive. Suddenly, they stumbled upon an old, overgrown path. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The whispering intensified, urging them forward. Following the path, they came across a dilapidated cabin, half hidden by the encroaching forest. The windows were shattered, and the door hung ajar. A sense of dread washed over them, but they couldn't turn back now. They pushed open the door and stepped inside, their flashlights illuminating the decaying interior. The air was thick with dust and the smell of mold. As they explored the cabin, they found old furniture, rotting and covered in cobwebs. In one corner, they discovered a small, leather-bound journal. Ethan picked it up and began to read aloud. October 12th, 1898. "We've been lost in these woods for days. No food, no water. The whispers, they won't stop. They tell us to follow, but I fear they lead to our doom. If anyone finds this, beware the whispering pines. The spirits here are restless, and they crave company." Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them. The whispers turned into frantic, desperate cries. "Join us. Stay with us." Panic set in. They ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The windows were sealed tight, and the cries grew louder, more insistent. They were trapped. Ethan and Sarah screamed for help, but their voices were swallowed by the forest. The whispers seemed to mock them, repeating their cries for help. "Help us, please." Back at the campsite, Mark and Laura woke to the sound of distant screams. They rushed out of their tents, but Ethan and Sarah were nowhere to be found. Grabbing flashlights, they followed the trail their friends had taken. The whispers led them to the old cabin. They found the door wide open and the interior empty, save for the journal lying on the floor. Laura picked it up, her hands trembling as she read the last entry. "Mark, we have to find them," she said, tears streaming down her face. But as they searched the forest, the whispers surrounded them, growing louder and more menacing. The trees seemed to close in, and the path back to the campsite disappeared. They were lost. The next morning, the park rangers found the campsite abandoned. The tents were empty, and there was no sign of the four friends. Whispering Pines claimed yet another group, their voices joining the chorus of lost souls, forever calling out to anyone who dared enter the haunted forest. David had been driving for hours. The endless stretch of highway and the monotonous hum of the engine were beginning to wear on him. He needed a place to rest, just for the night, and he was relieved when he saw a flickering neon sign in the distance. Vacancy, it read, Pine Hollow Motel. It wasn't the most inviting place, but it would do. He pulled into the gravel parking lot and walked into the small, dimly lit lobby. A middle-aged man with a receding hairline sat behind the counter, watching an old TV set. He looked up as David approached. "Looking for a room?" the man asked, his voice gruff. "Yeah, just for the night," David replied. The man slid a worn-out guest book across the counter. "Sign here. Room 307. It's at the end of the hall, 3rd floor." David signed the book, took the key, and made his way to his room. The motel had an eerie, run-down feel to it. The wallpaper was peeling, and the carpet was stained and threadbare. As he climbed the creaky stairs to the 3rd floor, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When he reached room 307, he unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a bed, a nightstand, and a dresser. A single window overlooked the parking lot. David dropped his bag on the bed and sat down with a sigh of relief. After a quick shower, he lay down, hoping to get some much-needed sleep. But as he closed his eyes, he heard a faint scratching noise. He sat up and listened. The sound seemed to be coming from the wall behind the bed. Dismissing it as the usual noises of an old building, he lay back down. The scratching continued, growing louder and more persistent. David turned on the bedside lamp and examined the wall. There was nothing there, just old, faded wallpaper. He pounded on the wall a couple of times, hoping to scare away whatever was making the noise. It stopped, and he sighed in relief, turning off the light. Moments later, the scratching resumed, this time accompanied by faint whispers. David's heart raced. He pressed his ear to the wall, trying to make out the words. It sounded like multiple voices, all whispering urgently, but he couldn't understand what they were saying. Frustrated and unnerved, David decided to go to the front desk to complain. He grabbed his key and headed down the hallway. As he passed by room 305, he noticed the door was slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of him, and he peeked inside. The room was dark, but he could make out a figure standing by the window. "Hello," he called out, but there was no response. The figure didn't move. A chill ran down his spine, and he quickly backed away, heading to the lobby. The man at the front desk looked up as David approached. "Something wrong?" he asked. "Yeah, there's a weird scratching noise coming from the wall in my room, and I heard whispers," David explained. "And I think there's someone in room 305. The man's expression darkened. 305? That room has been empty for years. No one goes in there. David felt a wave of unease. "But I saw someone in there." The man stood up, grabbing a flashlight. "Show me." They walked back to the third floor, and the man pushed open the door to room 305. The room was empty, just as he had said. Dust covered the furniture, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling. It was clear no one had been there for a long time. "But I saw someone," David insisted, feeling a knot of fear tighten in his stomach. The man turned to him, his face serious. "This place has a history. People have reported strange occurrences in room 307 and 305. Whispers, scratching, even sightings of figures. Some say the motel is haunted." David's blood ran cold. "Haunted? By what?" The man shrugged. "No one knows for sure. Some say it's the spirits of those who died here. Others think it's something darker." David didn't believe in ghosts, but the fear in the man's eyes was real. He decided he didn't want to stay another minute in that motel. "I'm checking out," he said firmly. The man nodded. "I understand." David hurried back to room 307, grabbed his belongings, and left the motel as quickly as he could. As he drove away, he glanced back at the dilapidated building, its windows dark and foreboding. He didn't know what he had experienced that night, but he was certain of one thing: he would never set foot in Pine Hollow Motel again. And as he sped down the highway, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the whispers and the scratching were still following him, lingering in the shadows of the night. Megan had always been a night owl. She loved the tranquility of the late hours when the city's hustle and bustle quieted down and the streets were empty. It was during these hours that she found solace, taking long walks through the city to clear her mind. Tonight, however, would be different. It was a cool, autumn evening, and Megan had decided to take a different route home. She wandered through narrow alleyways she had never explored before, drawn to their mysterious charm. The alleys were dimly lit, the occasional street lamp casting long, eerie shadows on the cobblestones. The air was thick with the scent of dampness and decay, and the silence was broken only by the distant hum of traffic. As she walked deeper into the maze of alleys, she noticed a peculiar feeling of unease. The shadows seemed to move, shifting in the corners of her vision. She dismissed it as a trick of the light and pressed on, determined to enjoy her solitary adventure. She turned a corner and found herself in a particularly narrow alley, the walls on either side towering over her. Halfway down the alley, she saw a figure standing in the shadows. The figure was barely visible, cloaked in darkness, but she could make out its silhouette. "Hello," Megan called out, her voice echoing off the walls. The figure didn't respond. It remained still, almost as if it were waiting. Megan's heart began to race. She considered turning back, but her curiosity got the better of her. She took a few cautious steps forward, keeping her eyes on the figure. As she got closer, the figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a man, his face obscured by a hood. His eyes, however, were visible, and they glinted with a sinister light. Megan stopped in her tracks, every instinct telling her to run. "Are you lost?" the man asked, his voice a low, unsettling whisper. "No, just taking a walk," Megan replied, trying to keep her voice steady. The man's lips curled into a crooked smile. "Be careful. These alleys can be dangerous at night." Megan nodded, her skin crawling. She turned to leave, but the man grabbed her arm, his grip cold and unyielding. "Wait," he said, his voice even softer, almost a hiss. "Do you know the legend of this alley?" Megan shook her head, fear tightening her chest. "They say it's haunted," the man continued, his eyes boring into hers. "By the spirits of those who vanished here. They were never found. Some say their souls still wander these alleys, looking for someone to take their place." Megan yanked her arm free and backed away, her heart pounding in her ears. "I have to go," she stammered, turning and breaking into a run. She sprinted down the alley, not daring to look back. The man's laughter echoed behind her, mingling with the whispers that now seemed to come from every direction. The alleyways twisted and turned, and Megan quickly realized she was lost. Panic set in as she frantically tried to find her way out. Every alley looked the same, and the shadows seemed to close in around her. She could hear footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate, keeping pace with her. Finally, she saw a light ahead, the end of the alley. She ran towards it with all her might, bursting out onto a familiar street. She stopped to catch her breath, glancing back at the dark mouth of the alley. The footsteps had stopped, and the only sound was her own ragged breathing. Megan hurried home, her nerves on edge. She locked the door behind her and collapsed onto her couch, trying to make sense of what had happened. She told herself it was just her imagination, a combination of shadows and fear playing tricks on her mind. But that night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She heard faint whispers outside her window, and shadows seemed to dance on the walls. She pulled the covers over her head, praying for morning to come. In the days that followed, Megan avoided the alleys, sticking to well-lit streets and busy roads. But the sense of unease never left her. She began to notice shadows out of the corner of her eye and whispers that seemed to follow her wherever she went. One evening, as she was walking home from work, she saw the same man from the alley standing on the corner of her street. His hood was up, and his eyes glinted with the same sinister light. Megan's blood ran cold. She turned and ran, not stopping until she reached the safety of her apartment. She locked the door and checked the windows, her hands trembling. That night, she heard the whispers again, louder and more insistent. The shadows on her walls seemed to take shape, figures emerging from the darkness. She realized, with a sinking dread, that the man was right. The spirits of the vanished were looking for someone to take their place, and they had chosen her. It was a perfect day for a picnic. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and the gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming flowers. Jenny, Mark, and their friends Laura and Tom decided to spend their Saturday in Glenwood Park, a lush, sprawling area just outside their town. They packed a large picnic basket with sandwiches, fruits, and homemade lemonade, eager to enjoy a relaxing afternoon in nature. They found a lovely spot near the edge of the forest, a picturesque clearing surrounded by tall trees that provided ample shade. The grass was soft and inviting, and a small brook babbled nearby. It seemed like an idyllic setting, straight out of a fairy tale. As they laid out their blanket and began to unpack their food, Jenny noticed an old, weathered sign half hidden among the trees. It was covered in moss and difficult to read, but she could make out the words, "Beware the Glen," in faded, barely legible letters. "Hey, guys, look at this," she called out, pointing to the sign. Tom, ever the skeptic, chuckled. Probably just an old warning about wild animals or something. This place is too beautiful to worry about that. Laura, however, felt a shiver run down her spine. Maybe we should set up somewhere else. That sign looks pretty serious. Nonsense, Mark said, spreading out the last of the food. We're here now, and it's perfect. Let's just enjoy ourselves. They all agreed and soon lost themselves in the joys of the picnic. They ate, laughed, and played games, the unsettling sign quickly forgotten. As the afternoon wore on, they decided to explore the forest a bit while the sun was still high. Walking through the dense trees, they marveled at the beauty of the glen. The light filtering through the leaves created a magical, dappled effect on the forest floor. But as they ventured deeper, an eerie silence fell over them. The birds stopped singing, and the rustle of leaves seemed muted. Suddenly, they came upon a strange sight, a circle of stones, perfectly arranged in the middle of a small clearing. The stones were ancient and covered in strange, unreadable carvings. In the center of the circle lay an old, decrepit picnic basket, almost identical to the one they had brought. "Okay, this is getting creepy," Laura said, her voice trembling. "Maybe it's some kind of art installation?" Mark suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. Tom approached the stones, examining the carvings. "These look like runes or something. Anyone know what they mean?" Jenny, who had studied folklore, stepped closer. "I've seen symbols like these before. They're supposed to be protective, but I'm not sure what they're protecting against." A sudden gust of wind blew through the clearing, and the sky darkened as if a storm were approaching. The friends exchanged uneasy glances. "We should go back," Jenny urged. "I have a bad feeling about this place." As they turned to leave, they realized they had lost their bearings. The path they had taken seemed to vanish, replaced by dense undergrowth and twisted trees. Panic set in as they tried to find their way back, but every direction looked the same. The forest seemed to close in around them, the air growing colder and thicker with each step. Shadows moved at the edge of their vision, and faint whispers echoed through the trees. It felt as if they were being watched by unseen eyes. "Stay close," Mark said, trying to keep calm. "We'll find our way out." But the forest had other plans. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the shadows seemed to solidify into figures that darted just out of sight. Laura tripped over a root and screamed as something cold brushed against her leg. "Help me," she cried, struggling to her feet. Tom and Mark rushed to her side, but Jenny was already moving forward, desperate to find a way out. She stumbled upon a narrow, overgrown path and shouted to her friends. "This way. I think I found something." They followed her, the whispers now a cacophony in their ears. The path led them to a small clearing where the old, weathered sign stood once more. But this time, there was something different about it. Fresh, red paint had been smeared across the words, turning the warning into a dire threat. "Beware the glen, now read, beware the curse." Before they could react, the ground beneath them shifted. The grass seemed to writhe, and the trees bent unnaturally. The shadows that had haunted them emerged fully, revealing themselves as ghostly figures with hollow, soulless eyes. The friends tried to run, but the forest came alive, roots and branches tangling around their legs, pulling them back. They screamed for help, but their voices were swallowed by the glen. As the shadows closed in, Jenny remembered the stones and the runes. "The circle," she shouted. "Get to the stone circle." Fighting against the forest's grip, they made their way back to the stone circle. The moment they crossed into the circle, the whispers ceased and the shadows stopped. The air grew still, and the oppressive feeling lifted slightly. "We're safe here," Jenny panted, "for now." "But what do we do?" Mark asked, panic still in his voice. "We have to break the curse," Jenny said, looking at the old picnic basket in the center of the circle. "I think it's connected to that." She approached the basket cautiously and opened it. Inside, she found a tattered, ancient book bound in leather. The pages were yellowed with age, and the writing was in a language she couldn't read. But there were pictures, images of the stone circle, the forest, and a ritual. "We need to perform the ritual," she said, her voice steady. "It's the only way to lift the curse." Following the instructions as best they could, they gathered ingredients from the forest, herbs, stones, and water from the brook. They arranged them according to the diagrams in the book and began to chant the words phonetically. The forest responded immediately. The wind howled, and the ground trembled. The ghostly figures reappeared, but they couldn't enter the circle. They watched, their hollow eyes filled with rage and desperation. With a final, powerful chant, the air grew still. The shadows vanished, and the oppressive feeling lifted. The forest returned to its serene, natural state, and the path back to their picnic spot reappeared. Exhausted and shaken, the friends gathered their belongings and quickly left the glen. As they reached the edge of the forest, Jenny looked back one last time. The stone circle was gone, replaced by an ordinary clearing. "Let's never come back here," Laura said, her voice trembling. "Agreed," Tom and Mark echoed. They drove away, the memory of the cursed picnic fading but never forgotten. From that day on, they avoided Glenwood Park, leaving its dark secrets and ancient curses to be buried in the whispers of the trees. Late one evening, Emma found herself standing alone at the deserted bus stop on the outskirts of town. She had missed the last train, and the only option to get home was the night bus, notorious for being unreliable and infrequent. The bus stop was dimly lit by a single flickering street lamp, casting long, wavering shadows on the cracked pavement. Emma checked her watch. It was nearly midnight. The cold wind bit at her skin, and she pulled her coat tighter, wishing she were anywhere but there. The bus schedule posted on the side of the shelter was worn and barely legible, but she could make out that the next bus was supposed to arrive in 15 minutes. As she waited, she heard a faint rustling sound behind her. She turned quickly but saw nothing but the empty street and the dark outline of nearby buildings. Trying to shake off the unease, she took out her phone and scrolled through social media to pass the time. A few minutes later, the rustling returned, louder this time, accompanied by a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. Emma's heart began to race. She looked around again, but the street was still empty. She was starting to feel truly nervous. Suddenly, an old man appeared seemingly out of nowhere. He was dressed in an outdated, ragged suit and had a peculiar, unsettling aura about him. His eyes were dark and hollow, and his skin was pallid, almost translucent. Waiting for the bus, he asked, his voice a low, rasping whisper. "Why, yes," Emma stammered, unnerved by his sudden appearance. "It should be here any minute now." The old man smiled, revealing yellowed, crooked teeth. "You must be careful at the stop, young lady. Strange things happen here at night." Emma tried to muster a polite smile. "What do you mean?" The old man's eyes seemed to darken further. "There are stories. People who wait here sometimes see things that aren't supposed to be seen. And some, they never make it home." Emma's unease grew. That's just an urban legend, right?" The old man chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. "Believe what you want, but keep your eyes open and your wits about you." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as suddenly as he had appeared. Emma's heart was pounding now, every nerve on edge. She glanced at her watch again. 5 more minutes until the bus was supposed to arrive. As the seconds ticked by, the wind picked up and the whispers grew louder, almost as if they were surrounding her. Emma strained to hear the words, but they were indistinguishable, a jumbled murmur of voices. She looked around desperately, hoping to see the lights of the approaching bus, but the street remained empty. Suddenly, she noticed movement in the shadows near the edge of the street lamp's light. She squinted, trying to make out what it was. The shape was indistinct at first, but then it started to become clearer. A tall, dark figure slowly approaching her. Emma's breath caught in her throat. The figure was draped in a long, flowing cloak, its face hidden beneath a hood. It moved with an unnatural, gliding motion, as if it were floating just above the ground. She wanted to run, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. The figure stopped just at the edge of the light, and for a moment, everything was deathly silent. Then, it spoke, its voice a chilling, echoing whisper. "You should not be here." Emma finally found her voice, though it was barely more than a whisper. "I'm just waiting for the bus." The figure pointed a skeletal hand down the street. "Leave now before it is too late." Terrified, Emma turned and ran, her footsteps echoing in the empty street. She didn't stop until she was several blocks away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She glanced back, but the street was empty. The bus stop was barely visible in the distance, the flickering street lamp a tiny beacon in the darkness. She called a friend to come pick her up, unable to bear the thought of returning to the bus stop. As she waited, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being watched, that the whispers were still following her, lurking just out of sight. When her friend arrived, Emma quickly got into the car, casting one last glance toward the bus stop. The old man and the cloaked figure were gone, but the unease lingered, a reminder of the night she would never forget. From then on, Emma avoided that bus stop, and whenever she passed it, she couldn't help but feel a chill run down her spine, remembering the whispers in the dark and the warning she had heeded just in time. Lily had always loved visiting her Aunt Margaret's old Victorian house in the countryside. It was a beautiful, sprawling mansion with creaky wooden floors, antique furniture, and a garden that seemed to stretch on forever. Every summer, Lily would spend a week there, exploring the nooks and crannies of the grand estate, losing herself in its timeless charm. This year, however, was different. Aunt Margaret had passed away 6 months ago, and the house had been left to Lily's family. They decided to spend a weekend there to sort through Margaret's belongings and decide what to do with the property. Lily was excited, but also apprehensive. The house felt different without her aunt's warm presence. They arrived on a cloudy afternoon, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. Lily's parents immediately set to work in the attic, sorting through old boxes and furniture, while Lily explored the familiar yet somehow foreign house. As she wandered through the dimly lit hallways, she noticed a door she had never seen before. It was at the end of a long corridor on the 2nd floor, partially hidden behind a large, dusty tapestry. Curious, Lily pushed the tapestry aside and tried the door handle. It was unlocked. The door creaked open, revealing a small, cluttered room filled with old books, trinkets, and a large, ornate mirror that took up most of one wall. The mirror was covered with a heavy, dark cloth. Intrigued, Lily stepped inside and uncovered the mirror. It was an exquisite piece, the glass flawless, and the frame intricately carved with strange symbols and faces. As she stared at her reflection, she felt a strange, unsettling sensation, as if the mirror was watching her. Lily shook off the feeling and continued to explore the room. She found old photographs of her aunt and other family members, some dating back over a century. The people in the photos seemed to be watching her too, their eyes following her every move. As the evening approached, Lily decided to join her parents in the attic. She was about to leave the room when she heard a faint whisper. She turned back, but the room was empty. Shaking her head, she closed the door behind her and hurried upstairs. The attic was musty and filled with dust, but Lily enjoyed helping her parents sort through the old items. They found antique jewelry, letters, and various keepsakes, each one a piece of her aunt's life. But as the night wore on, the house grew colder and the atmosphere more oppressive. After dinner, Lily decided to go to bed early. She chose the bedroom she had always stayed in, a cozy room with a four-poster bed and a view of the garden. As she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. Sometime after midnight, Lily was awakened by a soft, rhythmic tapping. She sat up and listened, her heart pounding. The sound was coming from the direction of the hidden room. Curious and a little scared, she grabbed a flashlight and crept out of her room. The hallway was dark and silent. She made her way to the hidden room, the tapping growing louder with each step. When she reached the door, she hesitated for a moment before opening it. The room was just as she had left it, but the mirror was uncovered, and the tapping was coming from within it. She approached the mirror cautiously, shining her flashlight on its surface. Her reflection stared back at her, but something was wrong. The room in the reflection was different, darker, and her reflection's eyes seemed to shimmer with a life of their own. Suddenly, her reflection moved independently, lifting a hand and tapping on the glass. Lily gasped and stepped back, but her reflection leaned forward, pressing its hands against the mirror as if trying to break through. The whispers returned, louder and more urgent. They seemed to be coming from all around her, a chorus of voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand. The room grew colder, and the shadows deepened. Lily's reflection smiled, a cold, malevolent grin, and began to push harder against the glass. Cracks started to form in the mirror, spreading like spiderwebs. Lily wanted to run, but she was rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear. Just as the mirror was about to shatter, a loud crash echoed through the house. The door to the room slammed shut, breaking Lily out of her trance. She turned and fled, the whispers and the tapping following her down the hallway. She burst into her parents' room, waking them with her frantic shouting. Something's in the house. The mirror. It's trying to get out. Her parents, groggy and confused, tried to calm her down. Lily, it was just a bad dream, her father said, but she could see the concern in his eyes. It wasn't a dream. Lily insisted. There's something in that room. We have to leave. Reluctantly, her parents agreed to check the room. They followed Lily down the hallway, but when they reached the door, it was locked. Her father tried the handle, then banged on the door. There's nothing here, Lily. It's just an old room. No, you have to believe me. Lily cried, but her mother gently guided her away. Let's just go back to bed, her mother said soothingly. We'll deal with it in the morning. Lily reluctantly agreed, but sleep was impossible. She lay awake, listening to the whispers that seemed to seep through the walls. She knew something was terribly wrong with the house, and she prayed for dawn. Morning came slowly, and Lily's parents decided it was best to leave. They packed their things quickly, the oppressive atmosphere of the house driving them to hurry. As they were leaving, Lily glanced back at the hidden room. The door was slightly ajar, and she saw her reflection watching her from within, smiling that cold, malevolent grin. They drove away from the house, leaving its dark secrets behind. But Lily knew she would never forget the terror of that night, the feeling of being watched, and the whispers that haunted her dreams. She hoped never to return, but the memory of the house and the mirror stayed with her, a reminder of the shadows that lurked in the corners of her mind. The sea was calm as the luxury yacht Seabreeze cut through the waters of the Caribbean. It was supposed to be the perfect vacation, clear skies, warm sun, and the gentle rocking of the boat. Amelia, Jake, and their friends Sarah and Lucas were looking forward to a week of relaxation and adventure on the open ocean. The first few days were idyllic. They swam in crystal-clear waters, lounged on the deck, and enjoyed gourmet meals prepared by the yacht's crew. Each night, they gathered on the deck to watch the sun set in a blaze of colors, sharing stories and laughter under the stars. On the fourth day, however, the weather took an unexpected turn. Dark clouds rolled in, and the sea grew choppy. The captain assured them it was just a minor squall and would pass by morning. The group decided to make the best of it, retreating to the yacht's cozy salon to play cards and sip cocktails. As the night wore on, the storm intensified. Lightning flashed, and thunder rumbled ominously. The yacht rocked more violently, and the crew advised everyone to stay inside. They followed the advice, but a sense of unease settled over them. Around midnight, Amelia excused herself to get some fresh air. She stepped out onto the deck, the wind whipping her hair and the rain stinging her skin. She leaned on the railing, watching the turbulent sea. As she gazed into the darkness, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. A ship was approaching, barely visible through the rain and mist. It was an old, decrepit vessel, its sails tattered and its hull covered in barnacles. It looked like it had been at sea for centuries. Amelia squinted, trying to make out the details, but the ship seemed to flicker in and out of existence. She rushed back inside, calling for the others. "There's a ship out there. It's heading straight for us." The others followed her onto the deck, peering into the stormy night. At first, they saw nothing, but then the ghostly ship emerged from the mist, closer now. Its lanterns glowed with an eerie, pale light, and ghostly figures moved about on deck. "Is this some kind of joke?" Lucas asked, his voice tinged with fear. The captain joined them, his face pale. "That's the Phantom of the Deep. It's a legend around these parts. They say it appears during storms and brings bad luck to any ship it encounters." "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "We wait it out," the captain replied grimly. "There's nothing we can do but hope it passes without incident." The group huddled together, watching as the ghost ship drew nearer. The ghostly figures on deck seemed to stare back at them, their hollow eyes filled with sorrow and menace. The Seabreeze shuddered as the Phantom of the Deep passed alongside, the air growing colder and the storm intensifying. Suddenly, the yacht's engines died and the lights flickered out. Panic set in as the group realized they were adrift in the storm, with the ghost ship still looming nearby. The crew scrambled to restore power, but nothing worked. Amelia felt a chill run down her spine as she saw one of the ghostly figures on the Phantom wave its hand. The gesture seemed to beckon them, as if inviting them to join the ghostly crew. She backed away from the railing, her heart pounding. "We need to get below deck," the captain ordered. "Now!" They hurried inside, but the sense of dread only grew. The air was thick with the smell of salt and decay, and the walls seemed to close in around them. The whispers began, soft at first, then growing louder, filling the cabin with ghostly voices. Amelia could make out fragments of the whispers, stories of doomed voyages and lost souls. She felt a cold hand brush her shoulder and spun around, but no one was there. The others heard the whispers too, their faces pale with fear. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice shaking. "We can't stay on this ship." "We can't leave," the captain replied. "We're stranded until the storm passes." As the night wore on, the ghost ship remained close, its ghostly crew seeming to watch their every move. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the temperature dropped further. Amelia felt as if she could see her breath, even though it was the middle of summer. Suddenly, the yacht lurched violently, throwing everyone off their feet. The ghostly figures were now on the sea breeze, their hollow eyes staring with a mix of pity and malevolence. Amelia saw a figure reach out to her, its hand icy cold. She screamed, and the figure vanished. The yacht shuddered again, and the storm began to abate. The ghost ship slowly faded into the mist, its lanterns dimming until they were nothing but faint glows in the distance. The whispers ceased, and the air grew warmer. The crew managed to restore power, and the yacht's engines roared to life. The captain navigated them back on course, away from the haunted waters. The group remained silent, shaken by their encounter with the phantom of the deep. As the sun rose, the storm was a distant memory, but the ghostly encounter was not so easily forgotten. The crew and passengers knew they had been touched by something otherworldly, something that defied explanation. When they finally reached port, they disembarked quickly, eager to be on solid ground. As they left the yacht behind, Amelia glanced back one last time, half expecting to see the ghost ship on the horizon. But there was nothing but the calm, blue sea. The experience haunted them all, a chilling reminder of the mysteries and dangers that lurked in the depths of the ocean. They vowed never to speak of it again, but the memory of the phantom ship and its ghostly crew remained, a dark shadow over their sunny vacation. The summer had promised nothing but fun and relaxation for Ben, Clara, Mike, and Lisa. They had been friends since high school, and this summer was their last one together before they all went off to different colleges. They decided to rent a secluded cabin by the lake, nestled deep in the woods, far from the distractions of their bustling hometown. The cabin was perfect, rustic yet comfortable, with a beautiful view of the serene lake. They spent their days swimming, hiking, and roasting marshmallows by the campfire at night. Everything seemed idyllic until strange things started happening. One evening, as the sun set and they gathered around the campfire, Clara told a local legend she had heard from the town's storekeeper. It was about a young girl named Emily who had drowned in the lake many years ago. It was said that her spirit still haunted the area, looking for someone to join her in the watery depths. "Don't be ridiculous," Mike scoffed. "It's just a story to scare tourists." "Maybe," Clara said, but her voice wavered slightly. "But they say people have seen her ghost wandering the shores at night." Ben and Lisa laughed it off, but as the night grew darker, an uneasy feeling settled over them. They decided to head inside and call it a night. Around midnight, Ben was awakened by a faint sound. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on the cabin's window. He sat up, listening intently. The sound continued, persistent and unnerving. He got out of bed and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. There was nothing there, just the dense woods and the shimmering lake under the moonlight. Ben shook his head, chalking it up to his imagination, and went back to bed. But the tapping continued, keeping him awake for most of the night. The next morning, Ben mentioned the noise to the others. "Did anyone else hear that tapping last night?" "I heard it too," Clara said, looking uneasy. "It was really weird." "Probably just an animal," Mike suggested, but even he seemed unsure. They decided to shake off their unease and enjoy the day. They went for a hike, explored the woods, and even took a canoe out on the lake. But the feeling of being watched never left them. That night, as they sat by the campfire again, the atmosphere was tense. They tried to lighten the mood by telling jokes and funny stories, but the shadows seemed to press in closer, and the wind whispered through the trees, almost as if it carried a voice. When they finally decided to go to bed, Clara insisted on closing all the windows and locking the doors. "Just to be safe," she said with a nervous laugh. Once again, Ben was awakened by the tapping. This time, it was louder, more insistent. He got up and checked the windows and doors, but everything was locked tight. The sound seemed to be coming from the lake. Curiosity and fear gnawed at him. He grabbed a flashlight and quietly slipped out of the cabin, following the sound. The others were still asleep, unaware of his departure. As Ben approached the lake, the tapping grew louder. He shone his flashlight over the water, and his heart nearly stopped. There, standing on the shore, was a figure in a white dress. Her hair was dark and wet, hanging limply over her face. She looked up, and for a moment, Ben could see her eyes, pale, empty, and haunting. "Emily," he whispered, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond but slowly walked into the water, disappearing beneath the surface. The tapping stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Ben ran back to the cabin, his mind racing. He burst inside, waking the others. "I saw her. I saw Emily." "Are you sure?" Lisa asked, her eyes wide with fear. "Yes. She was by the lake. We need to leave. Now." They didn't hesitate. They packed their bags in record time, throwing everything into their car. As they drove away, the cabin grew smaller in the rearview mirror, but the feeling of dread lingered. They reached the town at dawn and checked into a small motel. Exhausted and shaken, they finally felt safe enough to talk about what had happened. "I can't believe it," Clara said. "The legend is true." "It's not just a legend," Ben replied. "There's something out there, and it's not friendly." They spent the rest of the summer avoiding the lake, sticking to crowded, familiar places. The experience left a mark on them, a chilling reminder of the unseen forces that lurked in the world. Years later, they still talked about that haunted summer, but they never returned to the cabin by the lake. The memory of Emily and the tapping in the night stayed with them, a ghostly shadow that haunted their dreams. Sarah, David, Emily, and Jake had been friends since college and had a tradition of taking an annual beach trip together. This year, they decided to visit a remote coastal town known for its pristine beaches and towering sand dunes. They rented a charming cottage right by the shore, eager to spend their days basking in the sun and their nights around a beach bonfire. The first few days were perfect. They lounged on the beach, swam in the clear blue water, and explored the quaint town. The locals were friendly, though they often gave strange looks when they heard where the group was staying. When asked, the locals would only offer vague warnings about the Whispering Sands. Curiosity piqued, Emily asked an old fisherman about the name. "Why do they call it the Whispering Sands?" The old man looked at her with weary eyes. "The dunes around here, they say they whisper at night. Some say it's the wind, but others believe it's the spirits of those lost at sea." That night, as they sat around their bonfire, the group joked about the old man's story. "Ghosts in the sand dunes? Sounds like something out of a horror movie." David laughed. "Yeah, but it's kind of cool," Sarah said. "Imagine if it were true." As the fire crackled and the night grew darker, a cool breeze swept in from the ocean. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was soothing, and they began to relax, sipping their drinks and telling stories. Around midnight, the wind picked up, carrying with it a strange, faint sound. It was a soft, almost musical whisper, like a distant choir. The friends exchanged uneasy glances. "Did you hear that?" Jake asked, looking around. "It's probably just the wind," Sarah said, though she sounded unsure. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder and more distinct. It sounded as if voices were drifting through the air, speaking in a language none of them could understand. The whispers seemed to come from the dunes behind their cottage. "We should check it out," Emily suggested, her curiosity getting the better of her. Armed with flashlights, they made their way towards the dunes. The sand was cool under their feet, and the whispers grew clearer with each step. They climbed to the top of a particularly tall dune and looked out over the moonlit beach. "There's nothing here," David said, shining his flashlight around. "Wait, look at this," Jake called out, pointing to a patch of disturbed sand. They gathered around and saw what appeared to be footprints, but they were unlike any they'd ever seen, long and slender, almost inhuman. The whispers seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath their feet. Suddenly, Emily stumbled back, her flashlight illuminating an old, weathered sign partially buried in the sand. It read, "Beware the whispering sands." "We should go back," Sarah said, her voice trembling. They hurried back to the cottage, but the whispers followed them, growing louder and more insistent. That night, sleep was elusive as the eerie sounds continued, seeping through the walls and windows. The next day, they decided to ask the locals more about the legend. An elderly woman at the local bakery was more forthcoming. "The Whispering Sands are haunted by the spirits of sailors who drowned offshore. They say the sands are cursed, and anyone who disturbs them will be haunted forever." "Haunted forever?" David scoffed. "Come on, that's just a story. Believe what you want," the woman replied, her eyes serious. "But the whispers are real." That evening, as they prepared for another night, a sense of dread hung over them. They tried to keep their spirits up, but the whispers started earlier, and this time they were louder and more urgent. "Maybe we should leave," Sarah suggested, her fear palpable. "We can't let some spooky stories ruin our trip," David insisted, but even he looked uneasy. As night fell, the whispers became a chorus, filling the air with an unearthly melody. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and the temperature dropped sharply. The friends huddled together in the cottage, the flickering candlelight casting eerie shapes on the walls. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the door. They jumped, hearts racing. David cautiously approached the door and opened it, but there was no one there, just the shifting sands and the whispering wind. "We need to get out of here," Emily said, her voice shaking. They quickly packed their bags and loaded the car. As they drove away, the whispers followed them, growing fainter but never completely disappearing. The road out of town was dark and winding, and they kept glancing back, half expecting to see ghostly figures in the rearview mirror. When they finally reached a neighboring town, the whispers had faded completely. They found a small motel and checked in, exhausted and shaken. That night, they slept fitfully, haunted by the memories of the Whispering Sands. The next day, they decided to cut their trip short and head home. As they left, they couldn't help but feel a sense of relief, but also a lingering unease. The experience had left a mark on them, a chilling reminder of the whispers that haunted the dunes by the sea. Years later, they rarely spoke of that summer. When they did, it was with a sense of dread and disbelief. The Whispering Sands had become a ghost story of their own, a dark tale of a vacation that had promised relaxation, but delivered something far more sinister. Emma had always been skeptical of dating apps, but her friends finally convinced her to give it a try. "Come on, Emma," they had said. "It's the 21st century. Everyone's doing it." So, one night after a couple of glasses of wine, she downloaded Swipe Right and created a profile. After a few days of swiping left on countless profiles, she matched with a guy named Mark. He was handsome, charming, and seemed to have a lot in common with her. They chatted for a week, and Emma found herself looking forward to their conversations. Mark was funny, attentive, and made her feel special. Finally, they decided to meet in person. Mark suggested a trendy new restaurant downtown, and Emma agreed. The night of their date, she felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. She spent extra time getting ready, wanting to make a good impression. When she arrived at the restaurant, she spotted Mark immediately. He was even better looking in person, with a warm smile that put her at ease. They had a fantastic dinner, filled with laughter and easy conversation. Afterward, Mark walked her to her car and asked if she would like to go for a drive to a scenic overlook nearby. Hesitant but intrigued, Emma agreed. As they drove, the city lights faded and they entered a more secluded area. The road wound through dense woods, and Emma started to feel uneasy. "Are we almost there?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just a little further," Mark replied, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Finally, they arrived at the overlook. The view was breathtaking, with the city lights twinkling in the distance. But Emma's unease grew as she noticed how deserted the area was. They were completely alone. Mark suggested they take a short walk to a better vantage point. Emma hesitated, but his reassuring smile convinced her to follow him. They walked a short distance from the car when Mark suddenly stopped and turned to face her. "Emma," he said, his tone serious. "There's something I need to tell you." Emma's heart raced. "What is it?" He took a deep breath. "I'm not who you think I am." Before Emma could react, she felt a sharp pain in her neck. She reached up and felt a dart protruding from her skin. The world began to spin, and her vision blurred. She tried to scream, but her voice was barely a whisper. Darkness enveloped her. When Emma awoke, she found herself in a dimly lit room, tied to a chair. Panic set in as she realized she had no idea where she was or how long she had been unconscious. The room was cold and smelled of damp concrete. She struggled against the ropes, but they were too tight. The door creaked open, and Mark entered, his charming demeanor replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "You're awake," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Why are you doing this?" Emma demanded, fear and anger mixing in her voice. Mark smirked. "Because you're perfect. I've been looking for someone like you for a long time." Emma's mind raced, trying to think of a way out. "Please let me go. I won't tell anyone." He laughed, a chilling sound that echoed in the small room. "Oh, Emma, it's too late for that. But don't worry, you won't be alone for long." He left the room, and Emma heard the sound of a lock clicking into place. Desperation set in as she struggled harder against her bonds, her wrists raw from the effort. She scanned the room for anything she could use to free herself, but found nothing. Hours passed, and Emma felt her hope fading. She had no idea what Mark had planned, but she knew she had to escape. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door unlocking again. Mark entered, carrying a tray with a syringe and some vials. Emma's heart pounded. "What are you going to do?" "Just a little experiment," he said, filling the syringe with a clear liquid. "I've been working on something special, and you're going to help me test it." As he approached, Emma's fear turned to determination. She waited until he was close, then kicked out with all her strength, knocking the syringe from his hand. Mark stumbled back, and Emma seized the moment to tilt the chair, crashing to the floor and breaking it apart. Ignoring the pain, she scrambled to her feet and grabbed a broken piece of the chair, brandishing it like a weapon. Mark recovered quickly, his eyes narrowing with anger. "You shouldn't have done that," he hissed. Emma backed towards the door, her makeshift weapon held high. "Stay back." Mark lunged at her, and she swung the chair leg, striking him in the side. He grunted in pain but didn't stop. They struggled, and Emma managed to break free, running out the door and into a dark hallway. She sprinted through the maze of corridors, the sound of Mark's footsteps close behind. She had no idea where she was going, but knew she had to keep moving. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her heart felt like it would burst from her chest. Finally, she burst through a door and found herself outside. The night was dark, and she realized she was in an abandoned industrial area. She ran towards the faint glow of distant streetlights, hoping to find help. Behind her, she heard Mark's voice calling out, but she didn't look back. She kept running until she reached a road, waving frantically at an approaching car. The driver, seeing her desperate state, stopped and let her in. "Please help me," she gasped. "He's trying to kill me." The driver sped off, taking her to the nearest police station. Emma told the officers everything, and they immediately dispatched units to search for Mark. It wasn't long before they found the abandoned building and apprehended him. As the police escorted her home, Emma felt a mix of relief and lingering terror. She had survived, but the experience had left deep scars. She deleted the dating app and swore never to use one again. The memory of Mark's cold eyes and twisted smile haunted her, a reminder of the nightmare she had narrowly escaped. Tom had been working at Tony's Pizza for nearly 2 years, saving up for college. It was a typical Friday night, busy and bustling, with orders coming in nonstop. Tom was used to the hectic pace, but tonight felt different. There was an eerie tension in the air that he couldn't quite put his finger on. As the night wore on, the orders began to slow, and Tom was looking forward to finishing his shift. Just as he was about to clock out, the phone rang. Tony, the grizzled owner, answered it. His expression darkened as he listened. "Tom," Tony called out, covering the phone's mouthpiece. "Got one last delivery for you. It's a bit out of the way, but they offered a big tip." Tom sighed but agreed. "Sure thing, boss. What's the address?" Tony handed him a slip of paper. "It's an old house on the outskirts of town. Be careful out there." Tom grabbed the pizza and headed out to his car. The address was unfamiliar, but he punched it into his GPS and set off. The streets grew darker and more deserted as he drove, and the uneasy feeling from earlier returned. After about 20 minutes, he found himself on a narrow, winding road lined with thick trees. The house finally came into view, an old, decrepit mansion that looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. The windows were dark, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. Tom parked his car and grabbed the pizza, hesitating for a moment before walking up the creaky steps to the front door. He knocked, the sound echoing in the still night. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Just as he was about to turn and leave, the door creaked open. A pale, gaunt man stood in the doorway, his eyes sunken and hollow. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Come in," the man said, his voice a low whisper. "I have your payment inside." Tom hesitated. I'd prefer to stay out here, if you don't mind." "Nonsense," the man insisted. "It's not safe out there at night. Come in." Reluctantly, Tom stepped inside. The interior was just as dilapidated as the outside, with cobwebs hanging from the ceiling and dust covering every surface. The man led him to a dimly lit room where an old woman sat in a rocking chair, staring blankly at the wall. "Please, set the pizza down on the table," the man instructed. "I'll get your money." Tom did as he was told, glancing nervously at the old woman. She didn't acknowledge him, her gaze fixed on some unseen point. The man disappeared into another room, leaving Tom alone. Minutes passed and the man didn't return. Tom's unease grew, and he decided he'd had enough. He turned to leave, but the old woman suddenly spoke. "You're in danger," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom froze. "What do you mean?" "They won't let you leave," she continued. "You need to get out now." Heart pounding, Tom rushed to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. He yanked on it with all his strength, but it was as if it were glued shut. Panic set in, and he looked around for another way out. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see the man returning, a sinister smile on his face. "Is there a problem?" "The door's stuck," Tom said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need to go." "Oh, I'm afraid you can't leave," the man replied. "You see, you're part of the family now." Before Tom could react, the man lunged at him, knocking him to the ground. Tom fought back, kicking and punching, but the man's strength was unnatural. He felt himself being dragged back into the dim room, the old woman's eyes now wide with fear. "You must fight," she cried out. "Don't let them take you." Summoning all his strength, Tom broke free from the man's grip and ran deeper into the house, searching for an escape. He stumbled upon a staircase leading down to the basement and, with no other options, descended into the darkness. The basement was cold and damp, with a musty smell that made Tom gag. He could hear the man above, calling out for him, promising that resistance was futile. Desperation drove him to search for another exit, and he finally found a small window near the ceiling. He scrambled up, prying the window open and squeezing through. He fell to the ground outside, the fresh air filling his lungs. Without looking back, he ran to his car, started the engine, and sped away from the house. He didn't stop until he reached the safety of the pizzeria. Bursting through the door, he found Tony closing up for the night. "Tom, what happened?" Tony asked, alarmed by his disheveled appearance. "That house, it's cursed," Tom panted. "They tried to keep me there. The old woman warned me." Tony's face grew pale. "That address, it's been abandoned for years. No one's lived there since the family died in a fire decades ago." Tom's blood ran cold. "But I saw them. They were there." Tony shook his head. "You must have seen their ghosts. That house has a dark history. Many have gone there and never returned." Tom shuddered, realizing how close he had come to joining the lost souls of the Whispering Sands. He vowed never to deliver to an unknown address again and to be more cautious in the future. The experience haunted him for years, a chilling reminder of the dangers lurking in the most unexpected places. Jenny had just started her new job at the local supermarket, working the night shift. The hours were long and the store was eerily quiet at night, but the pay was good and she needed the money. It was her third night on the job, and she was beginning to get used to the routine of restocking shelves, cleaning, and occasionally helping the few late-night customers that wandered in. The supermarket was located on the outskirts of town, and it had a reputation for being haunted. Jenny had heard the stories from her coworkers, whispers of strange noises, shadows that moved on their own, and aisles that seemed to rearrange themselves. She didn't believe in ghosts, but the stories did make her feel uneasy. One night, as she was stocking the dairy section, she noticed the temperature drop suddenly. She shivered and rubbed her arms, glancing around. The store was empty, save for her and the security guard, Frank, who was stationed near the entrance. "Hey, Frank," Jenny called out as she walked towards the front. "Did you feel that cold draft?" Frank looked up from his magazine, his expression serious. "Yeah, it happens sometimes. This place has a mind of its own at night." Jenny chuckled nervously. "Well, it's creeping me out. Just keep busy," Frank advised. "The night's almost over." Jenny nodded and went back to her work, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. She was organizing the canned goods aisle when she heard a faint whisper. She froze, listening intently. The whispering grew louder, but she couldn't make out any words. It seemed to be coming from the next aisle over. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Is someone there?" There was no response. She grabbed her flashlight and cautiously walked around the corner, shining the light down the aisle. It was empty. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving an unnerving silence in its wake. Jenny shook her head, trying to convince herself that it was just her imagination. She returned to her work, but her unease only grew. Every so often, she caught glimpses of shadows moving at the edge of her vision, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there. Hours passed, and the whispering started again, this time louder and more insistent. Jenny felt a chill run down her spine as she realized it was coming from the stockroom in the back of the store. She hesitated, then decided to check it out. She needed to know what was going on. The stockroom was dimly lit and cluttered with boxes and shelves. Jenny walked slowly, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The whispering grew louder, almost as if it were surrounding her. She felt a presence, something cold and malevolent. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice echoing off the walls. Suddenly, a figure darted out from behind a shelf, knocking the flashlight from her hand. Jenny screamed and scrambled to pick it up, shining the light around frantically. She caught a glimpse of a pale, ghostly face before it vanished into the shadows. Heart pounding, she ran out of the stockroom and back to the front of the store where Frank was. "Frank, there's something in the stockroom," she gasped. Frank stood up, his face serious. "Show me." They walked back to the stockroom together, but when they arrived, it was empty. The whispering had stopped, and there was no sign of the ghostly figure. "I swear, I saw something," Jenny insisted. Frank nodded. "I believe you. This place is different at night. You're not the first to experience something like this." They returned to the front, and Frank called the store manager, explaining the situation. The manager, Mr. Thompson, arrived a short while later, looking concerned. "I've heard the stories, but I've never seen anything myself," Mr. Thompson said. "We'll check the security footage." They went to the security office and reviewed the footage. At first, it showed Jenny working in the aisles, but as they fast-forwarded to the moment she entered the stockroom, the screen flickered. Static filled the display, and when the image cleared, the figure she had seen was there, a translucent, ghostly shape moving through the stockroom. Mr. Thompson's face paled. I didn't think it was real." "We need to call someone," Frank suggested. "A priest or a paranormal investigator." Over the next few days, the supermarket brought in a local paranormal team. They conducted a thorough investigation, using various tools and techniques to detect any supernatural presence. Their findings were conclusive. The store was indeed haunted. The paranormal team explained that the supermarket had been built on the site of an old house where a tragic fire had occurred decades ago. The spirits of those who had perished in the fire were trapped in the building, their restless souls causing the strange occurrences. Mr. Thompson arranged for a cleansing ritual to be performed, hoping to bring peace to the spirits and end the haunting. Jenny attended the ritual, watching as the paranormal team performed their rites. Candles flickered, and the air was filled with the scent of incense. As the ritual progressed, the temperature in the store began to rise, and the oppressive feeling lifted. By the end of the night, the paranormal team declared the store cleansed. The whispering stopped, and the shadows no longer moved on their own. The eerie tension that had gripped the store was gone. Jenny continued to work at the supermarket, but the experience had changed her. She now believed in the supernatural and was more cautious, always aware of her surroundings. The store became just another job, but the memory of that night stayed with her, a chilling reminder of the unseen forces that can lurk in the most ordinary places. Jake had been working the night shift at the old gas station on Route 23 for about 6 months. It was a lonely job, but he didn't mind. He liked the quiet and the isolation, and it gave him time to work on his novel during the slow hours. The gas station itself was a relic from the 1950s, with creaky wooden floors and flickering fluorescent lights that cast eerie shadows across the shelves. One particularly dark and stormy night, Jake was behind the counter, engrossed in his writing, when he heard the familiar ding of the bell that signaled a car pulling up to the pump. He glanced up at the clock. It was just past midnight. He looked out the window and saw an old, black car parked by the pump. It looked like something out of a classic horror movie. Jake put down his pen and stood up, stretching his legs. As he walked to the window, he saw the driver step out of the car. It was a man in his late 50s, wearing a long, dark coat and a fedora pulled low over his eyes. The man's face was partially obscured by the brim of the hat, but there was something about him that made Jake's skin crawl. The man walked up to the door and pushed it open, the bell jingling overhead. He stepped inside, bringing with him a gust of cold air and the smell of rain. "Evening," Jake said, forcing a smile. "How can I help you?" The man looked around the store, his eyes lingering on the dark corners before finally settling on Jake. "Fill her up," he said in a low, gravelly voice, tossing a set of keys onto the counter. "And check the oil, too." "Sure thing," Jake replied, picking up the keys. He walked outside, the rain pelting down on him as he approached the car. He lifted the hood and checked the oil, then began to fill the tank. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced back at the store and saw the man standing at the window, staring at him. Jake quickly finished up and headed back inside, handing the keys back to the man. "All set," he said, trying to sound casual. "That'll be $30. The man pulled out a crisp $50 bill and handed it to Jake. "Keep the change," he said, his eyes never leaving Jake's. "Thanks," Jake said, putting the money in the register. "Have a good night." The man nodded and turned to leave. Just as he reached the door, he paused and looked back at Jake. "Be careful out here," he said. "Strange things happen on nights like this." Jake watched as the man got back into his car and drove off into the storm. He shivered and shook his head, trying to dismiss the uneasy feeling that lingered. He went back to his writing, but his mind kept drifting back to the strange encounter. An hour later, Jake was startled by the sound of the bell ringing again. He looked up to see another car pulling in, a sleek, black SUV. The driver got out, a woman in her 30s, looking frantic. She rushed into the store, her clothes soaked from the rain. "Please, you have to help me," she said, her voice trembling. "My car broke down a few miles back, and there's something out there, something following me." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. "Calm down," he said, trying to soothe her. "What happened?" The woman took a deep breath, her eyes darting around the store. "I was driving home when my car started acting up. I pulled over, and that's when I saw it, a shadowy figure, just standing by the side of the road, watching me. It started moving towards me, and I ran. I was so scared." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "Did you see who it was?" She shook her head. "No, it was too dark. But I could feel it, it wasn't human." Jake glanced out the window, his nerves on edge. The storm was getting worse, and the darkness outside seemed to press in on the small store. "Okay, you can stay here until the tow truck arrives. I'll call them for you." He picked up the phone and dialed the number for the local towing service. As he spoke to the operator, he kept an eye on the woman, who was pacing nervously. "They'll be here in about 30 minutes, he said after hanging up. "Thank you," she said, her voice still shaking. "I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't found this place." Jake nodded, trying to remain calm. "You're safe here," he said. "Just try to relax." The minutes ticked by slowly. Jake and the woman exchanged nervous glances, the tension in the room thickening with each passing moment. Then, suddenly, the power went out. The store was plunged into darkness, save for the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the room. Jake grabbed a flashlight from behind the counter and turned it on, casting a narrow beam of light around the store. "Stay close," he told the woman. "We'll be fine." They huddled together, the only sound the pounding rain and the occasional roll of thunder. But then, amidst the storm, they heard something else, a low, guttural growl coming from outside. "What was that?" the woman whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," Jake replied, his voice barely audible. "But we're not going to find out. Let's stay here and wait for the tow truck." The growling grew louder, and they could hear the sound of something scraping against the side of the building. Jake's flashlight flickered, and he tapped it desperately to keep it on. The woman clung to him, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. Then, without warning, the front door flew open, and the shadowy figure from the woman's story stepped inside. It was tall and cloaked in darkness, its eyes glowing a menacing red. Jake raised the flashlight, its beam revealing a gaunt, skeletal face with a twisted, malevolent grin. "Get back," Jake shouted, trying to sound brave. The figure took a step forward, and the temperature in the room plummeted. The woman screamed and backed away, but the figure moved with unnatural speed, reaching out a bony hand towards her. Jake grabbed a nearby shelf and pulled it down, creating a barrier between them and the figure. "Run," he yelled, pushing the woman towards the back of the store. They sprinted to the back room, slamming the door shut behind them. Jake barricaded it with whatever he could find, his hands shaking. "We have to find another way out," he said, his voice tight with fear. "There's a back exit," the woman said, pointing to a door at the far end of the room. They made their way to the exit, but just as they reached it, the door burst open and the shadowy figure loomed before them. Jake and the woman froze, their escape route blocked. In a desperate move, Jake grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and sprayed it at the figure. The cold blast seemed to disorient the creature, and it let out a screech of rage. Taking advantage of the distraction, Jake and the woman darted past it and out into the storm. They ran to the edge of the parking lot, where the tow truck had just arrived. The driver, a burly man named Bill, jumped out and saw the terror in their eyes. "What the hell is going on?" he asked. "No time to explain," Jake shouted. "Just get us out of here." Bill nodded and helped them into the truck. They sped away from the gas station, the shadowy figure fading into the distance. Jake looked back, half expecting to see it chasing after them, but it was gone. They drove to the nearest town, where they finally felt safe. Jake and the woman thanked Bill for his help and went to the police to report what had happened. The officers were skeptical, but agreed to investigate. In the weeks that followed, Jake couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered from that night. He quit his job at the gas station and moved to a new town, hoping to leave the nightmare behind. But the memory of the shadowy figure haunted him, a constant reminder of the terror that lurked in the darkness on Route 23. Elena had been looking forward to the school prom for months. It was her senior year, and this was the event that everyone talked about. The theme was a night to remember, and the gym had been transformed with twinkling lights, elegant decorations, and a large dance floor. Everyone was dressed to the nines, and the excitement was palpable. Elena arrived with her friends, and they quickly immersed themselves in the festivities. The music was loud, the laughter contagious, and the atmosphere electric. Everything seemed perfect, but as the night wore on, an unsettling feeling began to creep into Elena's mind. It started with small things, shadows that didn't quite match their sources, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, and a chill in the air despite the crowded room. She tried to brush it off, attributing it to nerves and excitement. Around midnight, the principal announced the start of the prom king and queen voting. As the students gathered to cast their votes, Elena decided to take a break from the crowd. She slipped out of the gym and into the quieter hallways of the school. The contrast was stark. the hallways were dimly lit and eerily silent. As she walked, she felt a growing sense of unease. She turned a corner and saw a door slightly ajar, leading to the old and used wing of the school. Curiosity got the better of her, and she pushed the door open. The air inside was colder, and dust particles floated in the beam of her phone's flashlight. She walked down the corridor, her footsteps echoing softly. Suddenly, she heard a faint sound music. But it wasn't the upbeat tunes from the gym. This was an old, scratchy melody, like something from a forgotten era. Elena followed the sound to a large, ornate door at the end of the hall. She hesitated, then pushed it open. Inside was an old, abandoned ballroom. The room was dark, save for the moonlight streaming through the tall, dirty windows. The music seemed to come from a gramophone in the corner, turning slowly on its own. In the middle of the ballroom stood a group of figures, dressed in vintage prom attire. They were dancing, but their movements were slow and unnatural, like puppets on strings. Elena's heart pounded as she realized they weren't living people. Their faces were pale, eyes hollow, and they moved with a ghostly grace. One of the figures, a tall boy in a tattered tuxedo, turned to look at her. His eyes met hers, and a cold smile spread across his face. He extended his hand towards her, as if inviting her to join the dance. Elena backed away, fear gripping her. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind her. The ghostly dancers began to move towards her, their expressions vacant and eerie. The music grew louder, drowning out her panicked breaths. She fumbled for the door, her hands shaking. Finally, she managed to wrench it open and bolted down the hallway, the cold air biting at her skin. She didn't stop running until she burst back into the gym, the warmth and noise of the prom enveloping her like a comforting blanket. "Elena, where have you been?" her friend Sarah exclaimed. "They're about to announce the prom king and queen." Elena could barely speak, her mind racing with what she had just seen. She looked back at the door she had come through, but it was closed, the hallway beyond looking normal. The principal took the stage, and the students gathered around. Elena stood with her friends, trying to calm herself. The principal opened the envelope and announced, "And the prom queen is Elena." Her friends cheered and pushed her forward. In a daze, she walked up to the stage, the applause a distant sound in her ears. She accepted the crown and the sash, feeling a strange disconnect from reality. As she stood on the stage, she glanced towards the back of the gym. There, just beyond the doors, she saw the tall boy from the ballroom, watching her with that same cold smile. Her heart skipped a beat, and she looked away, trying to focus on the present. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Elena danced with her friends, smiled for photos, and tried to enjoy the moment. But the memory of the ghostly dancers lingered in her mind, a chilling reminder of the night's strange events. When the prom finally ended, Elena and her friends walked out into the cool night air. She glanced back at the school one last time and saw the lights flicker in the old wing. She shivered and turned away, vowing to never speak of what she had seen. The next day, she did some research and discovered that the old ballroom had been sealed off decades ago after a tragic accident during a school dance. Several students had died in a fire, and their spirits were said to haunt the place. Elena realized that she had encountered those lost souls, still trapped in their final dance. The experience left her with a deep sense of unease, but she also felt a strange connection to them. They had chosen her as their queen, even if only for a night. Years later, when she looked back on her senior prom, it wasn't the music, the decorations, or the crown she remembered. It was the haunting dance of the lost spirits, forever etched in her memory as the last dance she would never forget. After an electrifying concert, Emma, Mike, and Lisa were buzzing with excitement as they piled into Mike's old sedan. The three friends had been looking forward to seeing their favorite band for months, and the night had exceeded all their expectations. The stadium had been packed, the music had been phenomenal, and they had sung along to every song. Now, as they set off for the long drive home through the rural backroads, they couldn't stop talking about their favorite moments. It was well past midnight, and the narrow, winding roads were deserted. The only light came from the car's headlights, cutting through the dense darkness. Emma sat in the front passenger seat, scrolling through the photos and videos she had taken, while Lisa dozed in the back, her head resting against the window. "Man, that was amazing," Mike said, glancing over at Emma. "I can't believe how good they were live." "I know, right?" Emma replied, smiling. "I'm so glad we went." They drove on in companionable silence for a while, the car's engine humming softly. Emma started to feel sleepy and leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes. Just as she was about to drift off, she felt a sudden jolt and the car swerved violently. "Mike, what's going on?" she cried, her heart racing. "I don't know," Mike said, struggling to control the car. "Something's wrong with the steering." The car came to a stop on the side of the road, and Mike turned off the engine. They sat in the darkness, the silence oppressive. Lisa woke up, rubbing her eyes. "What happened?" she asked groggily. "Car trouble," Mike replied, his voice tense. "I think we blew a tire or something. I'll go check it out." He grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the night. Emma and Lisa watched as he walked around the car, inspecting the tires. After a few minutes, he came back, his expression grim. "We've got a flat," he said. "I'll have to change it. Do you need help?" Emma asked, opening her door. "No, I've got it," Mike said. "Just stay inside where it's warm." Emma and Lisa nodded, watching as Mike retrieved the spare tire and jack from the trunk. He worked quickly, but the minutes felt like hours as they sat in the car, the darkness pressing in around them. Emma glanced out the window, her unease growing. The road was eerily quiet, and the surrounding woods seemed to close in on them. She could have sworn she saw shadows moving between the trees, but it was probably just her imagination. Finally, Mike finished changing the tire and got back in the car. "All set," he said, starting the engine. "Let's get out of here." They continued down the road, the tension in the car palpable. Emma tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over her, but it was hard to ignore. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the darkness outside the windows felt oppressive. After driving for another 20 minutes, they saw a figure standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the headlights. Mike hit the brakes, and the car screeched to a halt. The figure didn't move. "Who is that?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Mike said, his eyes fixed on the figure. "But I don't like this." The figure slowly started to walk towards them, and as it got closer, Emma could make out more details. It was a woman, dressed in tattered clothes, her hair matted and dirty. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, and she had a look of sheer terror on her face. "We need to help her," Emma said, reaching for the door handle. "Wait," Mike said, grabbing her arm. "Something's not right." The woman reached the car and banged on the hood, her eyes wild. "Please, you have to help me," she screamed. "They're coming. They're coming for me." Emma opened her door and stepped out, her heart pounding. "Who's coming?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. The woman looked over her shoulder, her face pale with fear. "The shadows," she whispered. "They're coming for us all." Suddenly, the air grew cold, and a dense fog rolled in, obscuring everything beyond the car. Emma felt a chill run down her spine as she heard whispers coming from the darkness. She looked back at the woman, but she was gone, vanished into the fog. "Get back in the car," Mike yelled, panic in his voice. Emma scrambled back inside, slamming the door shut. "What's happening?" Lisa cried, clutching the back of Emma's seat. "I don't know," Mike said, his eyes wide with fear. "But we need to get out of here now." He floored the gas pedal, and the car sped down the road, the fog closing in around them. The whispers grew louder, and Emma felt like they were coming from inside her own head. She glanced out the window and saw dark shapes moving in the fog, keeping pace with the car. "We're not alone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The shapes drew closer, and Emma could make out humanoid figures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. They reached out with shadowy hands, trying to grasp the car. The whispers turned into screams, filling the car with a deafening noise. "Drive faster," Lisa screamed, her eyes wide with terror. "I'm trying," Mike shouted, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and the figures kept closing in, their screams growing louder. Just when it seemed like they were going to be overtaken, the fog suddenly lifted and the car burst out into a clear, moonlit night. The whispers and screams stopped, and the figures disappeared. The road ahead was clear, and they could see the lights of a small town in the distance. Mike slowed down, his hands shaking. "What the hell was that?" He gasped, his face pale. "I don't know," Emma said, her heart still racing. "But I don't think we should ever come back this way." They drove into the town and found a diner that was still open. They parked the car and went inside, grateful for the warmth and light. The waitress gave them curious looks as they sat down, but they didn't care. They ordered coffee and sat in silence, trying to process what had just happened. As they sipped their drinks, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they had narrowly escaped something truly horrifying. She glanced out the window, half expecting to see the shadowy figures waiting for them. But the night was calm and quiet, and the only shadows were cast by the streetlights. They finished their coffee and got back in the car, driving the rest of the way home without incident. But the memory of that night stayed with them, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of the headlights. They never spoke of it again, but each of them knew that they had experienced something inexplicable and terrifying on that long ride home. Sophie always loved visiting her grandmother's house. It was a charming old Victorian with creaky wooden floors, a wraparound porch, and an air of nostalgia that made her feel at home. Her grandmother, a warm and loving woman, always welcomed her with open arms and a plate of freshly baked cookies. But there was one part of the house Sophie had never explored, the attic. Her grandmother had always kept it locked, saying it was full of old junk and too dangerous to venture into. But on this particular visit, Sophie's curiosity got the better of her. She had heard strange noises coming from the attic at night, whispers, footsteps, and once, even the sound of a music box playing a haunting melody. One rainy afternoon, while her grandmother was napping, Sophie found the key to the attic in an old jewelry box on her grandmother's dresser. Her heart pounded with a mix of excitement and fear as she made her way up the narrow staircase to the attic door. She hesitated for a moment, then inserted the key and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, dusty space filled with cobwebs and forgotten memories. Sophie stepped inside, her flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, boxes of antiques, and covered paintings. She carefully navigated through the maze of objects, her curiosity driving her deeper into the attic. In the far corner, she found an old trunk covered in dust. She brushed it off and opened it, revealing a collection of old photographs, letters, and a beautiful, but worn, music box. She picked up the music box and opened it, revealing a delicate ballerina that began to spin as a hauntingly familiar tune played. As the melody filled the attic, Sophie noticed something strange. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and the whispers she had heard at night became louder. She turned around and saw a figure standing in the corner, shrouded in darkness. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The figure stepped forward, and Sophie gasped. It was a young woman, dressed in a tattered old dress, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. "Help me." Sophie's fear was replaced by a sense of urgency. "Who are you?" she asked, stepping closer. "My name is Eleanor," the woman replied. "I was trapped here long ago. Your grandmother, she locked me in the attic." Sophie's heart raced. That can't be true. My grandmother would never do such a thing. Eleanor's expression was filled with despair. "She didn't mean to hurt me. It was an accident. But now I can't leave. I need your help to be free." Sophie felt a chill run down her spine. She had to know the truth. She dug through the trunk, finding old letters and diaries that told a story of a tragic accident. Eleanor had been her grandmother's sister, and she had died in the attic many years ago. Her spirit had been trapped there ever since. Tears filled Sophie's eyes as she read the heartbreaking accounts. She looked up at Eleanor, who seemed to be fading away. "What can I do to help you?" she asked. Eleanor pointed to the music box. "Play the melody one last time. It will set me free." Sophie nodded and wound up the music box again. As the melody played, Eleanor's form began to shimmer and fade. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. The music box played its final notes, and Eleanor disappeared, leaving behind a sense of peace and quiet. Sophie sat there for a moment, absorbing what had just happened. She carefully packed everything back into the trunk and closed it. When she returned downstairs, her grandmother was awake, sitting in her favorite chair by the fireplace. Sophie sat beside her, holding the music box in her hands. "Grandma, I went into the attic," she confessed. Her grandmother's eyes widened with surprise and a hint of sadness. "Oh, Sophie, you shouldn't have." "I know about Eleanor," Sophie said gently. "I helped her find peace." Her grandmother's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, dear. It's something I've carried with me for so long. I'm glad she's finally at rest." They sat together in silence, the rain tapping softly against the windows. Sophie knew that the attic held many secrets, but it was a place of peace now. And as she listened to the rain, she felt a sense of closure and the warmth of her grandmother's love. Jake and his girlfriend, Emily, were excited for the weekend getaway. Their friend Mark had recently inherited an old house from his late uncle, and he invited them to come check it out. The house was located in a remote area, surrounded by dense woods, and had a reputation for being haunted. Jake and Emily didn't believe in ghosts, so they accepted Mark's invitation without hesitation. The drive to the house was uneventful, and as they pulled up to the property, they were struck by the house's imposing presence. It was a large, two-story Victorian with peeling paint and overgrown bushes. Despite its dilapidated state, there was something charming about it. Mark greeted them at the door, smiling broadly. "Welcome to my new home," he exclaimed. "It's a bit of a fixer-upper, but I think it has potential." Jake and Emily exchanged amused glances. "It's certainly got character," Jake said. "Come on in. I'll give you the tour," Mark said, leading them inside. The interior of the house was just as old and worn as the exterior. The floors creaked with every step, and a musty smell permeated the air. Mark showed them around, pointing out the various rooms and detailing his plans for renovations. Emily noticed a few old family portraits on the walls, their eyes seeming to follow her as she walked by. "This place is pretty spooky," she whispered to Jake. "Yeah, but it's kind of cool too," he replied. After the tour, they settled into the living room, where Mark had set up some chairs and a makeshift table. They spent the evening chatting and sharing stories, laughing and enjoying each other's company. As the night wore on, The conversation turned to the house's history. "So, have you noticed anything strange since you moved in?" Emily asked. Mark shrugged. "Not really. Though, sometimes I hear noises at night, like footsteps or whispers. But it's an old house. It's probably just settling." Emily shivered. "Well, I'm glad we're staying in the guest room and not the attic." Mark chuckled. "The guest room is actually one of the nicer rooms in the house. I made sure it was clean and comfortable for you guys." They talked for a while longer before deciding to call it a night. Mark showed Jake and Emily to the guest room, a cozy space with a large bed and a window overlooking the backyard. They thanked him and got ready for bed. As they lay in the dark, Jake held Emily close. "Don't worry," he whispered. "It's just an old house. There's nothing to be afraid of." Emily nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She eventually drifted off to sleep, but her dreams were filled with unsettling images of shadowy figures and eerie whispers. Jake woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of creaking floorboards. He sat up, listening intently. The noise seemed to be coming from the hallway. He gently shook Emily awake. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Emily rubbed her eyes and listened. The creaking continued, growing louder and closer. "What is that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know. Stay here," Jake said, getting out of bed. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, then slowly opened the bedroom door. The hallway was empty, but the creaking persisted. Jake stepped out, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He followed the sound down the hallway and towards the staircase leading to the attic. "Jake, don't go up there," Emily whispered from the doorway. "I'll be fine," he assured her, though he didn't feel as confident as he sounded. Jake climbed the stairs, each step groaning under his weight. When he reached the attic door, he hesitated. The air was colder up here, and he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He took a deep breath and opened the door. The attic was pitch black. He swept the flashlight around, revealing old furniture, boxes of forgotten belongings, and cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. The creaking had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. "Hello," Jake called out, his voice echoing in the large space. There was no response. He stepped further into the attic, feeling a chill run down his spine. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him, and the flashlight flickered and went out. Jake's heart raced as he fumbled with his phone, trying to get the flashlight back on. He heard whispers all around him, unintelligible and sinister. Panic set in, and he banged on the door. "Emily, Mark, help!" Downstairs, Emily heard Jake's cries and ran to wake Mark. "Something's wrong. Jake's trapped in the attic." Mark jumped out of bed and followed Emily to the attic stairs. They could hear Jake pounding on the door and shouting. Mark tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Stand back," Mark said, and with a determined push, he forced the door open. Jake stumbled out, pale and trembling. "We need to get out of here," he gasped. "What happened?" Emily asked, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," Jake said, shaking his head. "But there's something in that attic. Something not right." Mark looked skeptical, but saw the fear in Jake's eyes. "All right, let's get out of here. We can stay at my place in town." They quickly gathered their things and left the house, the eerie atmosphere following them out into the night. As they drove away, Emily glanced back and saw a figure standing in the attic window, watching them. They spent the night at Mark's apartment, but none of them slept well. The next morning, they returned to the house to collect the rest of their belongings. The attic was quiet and empty, but the unsettling feeling lingered. Mark decided to investigate the history of the house and discovered that his uncle had been obsessed with the supernatural. He had conducted seances in the attic, attempting to contact the spirits of the house. It seemed he had succeeded, but at a terrible cost. Jake, Emily, and Mark never returned to the house after that weekend. Mark eventually sold it, warning the new owners about the strange occurrences. They never spoke of that night again, but the memory of the old house and its dark secrets haunted them for years to come. In the small, isolated village of Crimson Hollow, nestled deep within the forest, legends of a vampire had persisted for centuries. The villagers whispered tales of a dark, immortal creature that lurked in the shadows, preying on the unsuspecting. Most dismissed these stories as mere folklore, but some believed them with unwavering conviction. Lila, a young and curious woman, had recently moved to Crimson Hollow to escape the chaos of city life. She found the village charming, with its quaint cottages and close-knit community. However, she couldn't ignore the strange looks and hushed conversations that followed her whenever she ventured into the local tavern or market. One evening, Lila was invited to dinner at the home of Mr. Hawthorne, the village historian. Intrigued by the legends, she accepted, hoping to learn more about the village's dark past. As she walked to his house, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The moon hung low in the sky, casting eerie shadows through the trees. Mr. Hawthorne greeted her warmly, and they settled in the cozy parlor with cups of steaming tea. The walls were lined with ancient books and faded maps, creating an atmosphere of timeless knowledge. "I've heard whispers about a vampire in these parts," Lila began, trying to sound casual. "Do you think there's any truth to those stories?" Mr. Hawthorne's expression grew serious. "The legends of the Crimson Hollow vampire are not to be taken lightly," he said. "Many generations ago, there was a nobleman named Victor Draven. He was known for his charm and intelligence, but also for his strange, reclusive behavior. One night, he vanished without a trace, and shortly after, villagers began to disappear. The bodies were found drained of blood, their faces twisted in terror." Lila shivered. "Do you believe Victor Draven was a vampire?" Mr. Hawthorne nodded slowly. "The evidence is compelling. There were reports of a figure resembling Draven seen at night, and his manor, deep in the forest, remains untouched. Few dare to go near it." Lila felt a surge of curiosity and determination. "I want to see the manor," she declared. Mr. Hawthorne's eyes widened with alarm. "That is not a wise idea, Miss Lila. The manor is said to be cursed, and those who enter rarely return." But Lila was undeterred. She thanked Mr. Hawthorne for the information and left, her mind set on uncovering the truth. She prepared for her journey, packing a flashlight, a map, and a silver crucifix she found in the village's antique shop. The next day, she set out at dawn. The forest was thick and foreboding, but Lila pressed on, following the directions Mr. Hawthorne had given her. After several hours, she reached a clearing, and there it stood, Victor Draven's manor. The building was imposing, with dark, ivy-covered walls and broken windows that seemed to watch her approach. Lila took a deep breath and pushed open the creaking front door. Inside, the manor was eerily silent. Dust covered the once grand furniture, and cobwebs hung from the chandeliers. She explored cautiously, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. In the library, she found a collection of old journals. One, in particular, caught her eye. It was Victor Draven's diary. She opened it and began to read, the pages revealing a descent into madness. Draven had become obsessed with the idea of immortality and had turned to dark rituals to achieve it. His final entry was chilling. "I have succeeded. Eternal life is mine, but at a terrible cost." As she read, the air grew colder, and a sense of dread filled the room. Lila heard footsteps behind her and spun around, her heart pounding. Standing in the doorway was a tall, pale figure with piercing red eyes. "Welcome, Miss Lila," the figure said, his voice smooth and cold. "I've been expecting you." Lila's mind raced. Victor Draven? The vampire smiled, revealing sharp fangs. Indeed. And now, you've come to join me in my eternal existence. Lila backed away, clutching the crucifix. I won't let you turn me into a monster. Draven laughed softly. You have no choice. Lila knew she had to act quickly. She remembered the stories she had read about vampires and their weaknesses. Summoning all her courage, she held up the crucifix and began to recite a prayer. Draven recoiled, his eyes burning with fury. You cannot defeat me, foolish girl. But Lila continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. The vampire shrieked in agony, his form flickering like a shadow. With one final, desperate effort, Lila threw the crucifix at Draven, and it struck him in the chest. There was a blinding flash of light, and Draven let out a blood-curdling scream. His body disintegrated into ash, leaving behind only silence. Lila collapsed to the floor, trembling with exhaustion and relief. When she finally found the strength to stand, she knew she had to leave the manor and never return. She made her way back through the forest, the weight of what she had experienced heavy on her mind. The villagers were astonished to see her alive, and when she recounted her story, they were both horrified and grateful. Crimson Hollow slowly returned to normal, the legend of the vampire fading into history. Lila became a local hero, but she never forgot the terror she had faced. She had confronted the darkness and survived, but the memory of Victor Draven's eyes haunted her dreams for years to come. Rachel had just started a new job at a sleek, modern office building in downtown Chicago. It was an exciting opportunity, and she was eager to make a good impression. The office was stylish and well-equipped, with large windows offering a panoramic view of the city's skyline. However, there was one aspect of the office that unsettled her: the history. On her first day, she overheard her colleagues mentioning strange occurrences and ghostly sightings in the office. Rachel brushed off the stories as office gossip until she experienced something she couldn't ignore. One evening, after working late to finish a project, Rachel was alone in the office. The fluorescent lights cast an eerie glow over the empty desks and cubicles. She was just about to wrap up for the night when she heard a soft, melodic chime coming from the break room. It was an old-fashioned music box tune that seemed oddly out of place in the sterile environment. Curious, she followed the sound. As she approached the break room, the music abruptly stopped. Rachel hesitated at the door, then pushed it open. The room was empty, and the source of the sound was nowhere to be seen. Shrugging off the chill that ran down her spine, she turned to leave. That's when she noticed something peculiar. The office's usually pristine kitchen counter was covered in flowery footprints, as if someone had walked through a cloud of flour and left a trail. She frowned, puzzled. It was late, and the office had been clean when she arrived. As Rachel cleaned up the mess, she felt a sudden draft. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the overhead lights flickered. She turned to see the shape of a man standing in the doorway, a shadowy figure with a somber expression. "Hello," Rachel called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The figure didn't respond, but remained standing there, motionless. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She grabbed her phone and tried to call security, but the call wouldn't go through. Panic set in as the figure slowly began to move towards her. Desperate, Rachel backed away and stumbled over a chair. The figure advanced, and she could now see that it was dressed in an old-fashioned suit and tie, looking as though it belonged to a bygone era. The figure's face was obscured, but Rachel could feel its sorrowful gaze piercing through her. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging the office into darkness. Rachel fumbled for her flashlight and turned it on. The figure had vanished, but the room was now filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. She decided it was best to leave immediately. As she hurried towards the elevator, she glanced back and saw that the office doors, which were normally locked after hours, were now slightly ajar. The music box tune started up again, louder this time, echoing through the empty halls. Rachel made it to the elevator and pressed the button frantically. As the doors closed, she glanced one last time towards the office. The shadowy figure reappeared in the hallway, watching her with its mournful eyes. The elevator descended quickly, and Rachel left the building, not stopping until she was safely outside. The cold night air did little to calm her nerves. She couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister had followed her. The next day, Rachel returned to the office with the intent of reporting the incident. She met with her supervisor, Mr. Johnson, and shared her experience. To her surprise, he was not entirely dismissive. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," Mr. Johnson said, his expression grave. "The building's history is complicated. We've had other employees report similar occurrences. There's a legend about a former employee who disappeared under mysterious circumstances many years ago. They say his spirit still roams the office." Rachel listened, horrified. "What happened to him?" Mr. Johnson sighed. "No one really knows. He was a brilliant man, but he became increasingly disturbed and then vanished without a trace. Some believe he was involved in something he shouldn't have been, and his spirit was bound to the office as a result." The office's management had attempted to exorcise the building and put measures in place to address the supernatural occurrences, but the haunting persisted. Rachel decided she could not continue working in such an environment. She handed in her resignation and left the job, her experience leaving a lasting impression. The building was eventually renovated and repurposed, but the tales of the office specter remained part of its dark legacy. Years later, Rachel would occasionally drive by the building, glancing up at its imposing structure and shiver at the memory of that cold, dark night when she came face to face with the ghostly figure of the office. The experience was a chilling reminder that some places hold onto their pasts, no matter how hard they try to move forward. It was the first week of the semester at Maplewood University, and Sarah was thrilled to start her freshman year. Assigned to a single room in the historic Hawthorne Hall, she felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. The building, a grand structure dating back to the 1920s, was renowned for its classic architecture and old-world charm. Some students loved its vintage appeal, while others whispered about strange occurrences and eerie happenings. Sarah quickly settled into her new room, which featured large windows overlooking a peaceful courtyard. The space was quaint, with antique furnishings that gave it a cozy, nostalgic feel. Although Sarah was enthusiastic about her new beginning, she couldn't ignore the occasional strange occurrences, objects that seemed to move on their own, and the eerie whispers she thought she heard at night. She chalked these up to the stress of starting college and adjusting to dorm life. One quiet evening, after a long day of classes, Sarah decided to study in the common area of the dormitory. The common area was a large, inviting space with high ceilings, plush chairs, and a fireplace. While she worked, she noticed an old photograph hanging on the wall. It depicted a group of students from the 1920s standing proudly in front of Hawthorne Hall. One young woman in particular caught Sarah's attention, a student with dark eyes and a solemn expression. Curious about the photograph, Sarah approached Olivia, the dormitory's resident assistant, who was lounging in the common area. "Who is that woman in the photo?" Sarah asked, pointing to the image. Olivia's face went pale. "That's Eleanor Carter. She was a student here many years ago. Her story is, well, it's quite unsettling." Sarah leaned in, intrigued. "What happened to her?" Olivia's expression grew serious. "Eleanor disappeared mysteriously during her senior year. Some say she was involved in something secretive and dangerous. Her disappearance was never solved, and there have been rumors ever since that her spirit haunts the dormitory. Sarah was skeptical but couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over her. That night, as she prepared for bed, she heard a soft, melodious chime coming from the break room, a sound that seemed oddly out of place in the quiet dormitory. When she went to investigate, she found the break room empty and the source of the sound gone. Later, as Sarah was about to go to sleep, she noticed that the room felt unusually cold. The shadows on the walls seemed to dance, and she heard faint whispers, like a distant conversation. She turned on her bedside lamp and looked around, but everything appeared normal. She switched off the light to go back to sleep, but the whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent. Feeling unnerved, Sarah decided to investigate further. She noticed that the photograph of Eleanor on the wall was now slightly askew. As she adjusted it, she felt a cold breeze pass through her, and the whispers grew louder. She grabbed her phone to call for help, but the call wouldn't go through. The next morning, Sarah recounted her experience to Olivia, who was visibly concerned. "It's not uncommon for Eleanor's spirit to become restless," Olivia said. "She's known to communicate with people who are alone or stressed. If you're hearing whispers, it might be her trying to get your attention." Determined to uncover the truth, Sarah decided to confront the situation directly. That evening, she set up a candle and a notepad on her desk and attempted to communicate with the spirit. She wrote a message: "If you need to tell me something, I'm listening." As the candle flickered, Sarah felt a cold draft and noticed that the shadows in the room seemed to move. The whispers started again, growing louder and more frantic. She could almost make out the words, "Help, trapped." Suddenly, the candle went out, and the room was plunged into darkness. Sarah's flashlight barely illuminated the room, and the shadows seemed to twist and writhe. The photograph of Eleanor fell from the wall, and Sarah's heart raced as she picked it up. Eleanor's face seemed even more desperate and pleading. Sarah knew she had to act. She researched Eleanor's disappearance and discovered old newspaper articles that mentioned a secret society and a hidden room within the dormitory. Determined to find out more, Sarah enlisted Olivia and a few friends to explore the basement of Hawthorne Hall. The group found a hidden passage behind a bookcase in the basement. The passage led to an old, forgotten storage room filled with dusty boxes and old furniture. Among the items, they discovered a locked drawer containing a diary. With great effort, they pried open the drawer and found the diary, Eleanor's diary. The diary revealed Eleanor's involvement in a secret society that had operated in the dormitory. She had uncovered something dangerous and was trying to escape when she vanished. The final entries were filled with fear and a plea for help. Armed with this new evidence, Sarah and Olivia brought the diary to campus authorities. The university launched a thorough investigation and uncovered the truth about Eleanor's fate. It turned out that Eleanor had been a victim of a conspiracy involving some faculty members who wanted to silence her. The case was reopened, and justice was finally served. With the mystery resolved, the disturbances in the dormitory ceased. Eleanor's spirit, having been acknowledged and remembered, was finally at peace. Hawthorne Hall became known not just for its history, but for the resolution of its dark past. Sarah became a local hero, her bravery and determination bringing closure to both the dormitory and the story of Eleanor Carter. The once chilling whispers became a tale of justice and courage. Sarah often reflected on her experience, grateful that she had faced the darkness and uncovered the truth. Hawthorne Hall, once a place of fear, was now a symbol of resilience and the quest for justice. It was a chilly autumn evening when Emma, a young firefighter, began her night shift at Station 13, an old firehouse on the outskirts of town. The station had been operating for nearly a century and was known for its vintage charm and historic value. Its brick walls and classic architecture gave it an air of nostalgia, but also a whisper of mystery. The firehouse had seen better days, and though it was functional, it had a reputation for being somewhat run down. Emma had heard stories of strange occurrences and eerie experiences associated with the station, but she was determined to prove herself despite the unsettling tales. The first few hours of her shift went by uneventfully. Emma familiarized herself with the firehouse's layout and the old equipment. The fire trucks, though somewhat aged, were in good working condition. The other firefighters, a small, tight-knit group, were friendly but seemed unusually tense. They casually mentioned the station's quirks, but brushed off the ghost stories as mere legends. As midnight approached, the atmosphere in the firehouse began to shift. The air grew colder, and Emma noticed that the lights flickered sporadically. The chill seemed to seep into her bones, making her shiver despite the warm uniform she wore. Emma tried to dismiss it as a draft or faulty wiring, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. Around 2 a.m., Emma was alone in the common room, poring over maintenance logs. The room was dimly lit by a few desk lamps, and the silence was occasionally broken by the creaks of the old building. She heard a soft, rhythmic thumping coming from the direction of the equipment bay. At first, she thought it might be the old machinery, but the sound was too deliberate and seemed too organized to be a mere mechanical malfunction. Curious and slightly apprehensive, Emma decided to investigate. As she walked towards the equipment bay, the temperature dropped even further. Her breath became visible in the air, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. When she reached the bay, she found one of the old fire trucks slightly out of place, as though it had been moved recently. The rhythmic thumping had stopped, but a strange sense of foreboding filled the space. Emma's flashlight flickered and then went out, plunging her into darkness. The sudden lack of light made the shadows seem to come alive. She heard the sound of footsteps, heavy, purposeful steps, approaching from behind. Emma spun around, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The footsteps continued, growing closer and closer, and she could feel an oppressive presence looming over her. Desperate to regain control of the situation, Emma hurried back to the common room and turned on every light she could find. Her heart pounded as she tried to calm herself. She grabbed her radio to contact the other firefighters, but there was only static. She tried again, but the interference remained. With no way to reach out for help, Emma decided to dig deeper into the station's history. In the office, she found old records and newspaper clippings about the firehouse. The articles detailed a tragic event that occurred decades earlier, a devastating fire at a nearby warehouse. Station 13's crew had rushed to the scene, but the fire proved too fierce. Several firefighters, including Captain Andrew Wells, perished that night. Captain Wells was described as a brave and dedicated leader who had stayed behind to ensure everyone else was evacuated. Realizing that the ghostly disturbances might be connected to Captain Wells, Emma decided to investigate further. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of purpose, she returned to the equipment bay. She set up a candle and placed it on a nearby workbench, hoping that its light would offer some comfort. As she spoke aloud, Emma said, "Captain Wells, if you're here, I'm here to listen. I want to understand what happened and help if I can." The room grew even colder, and the shadows seemed to swirl around her. The rhythmic thumping started again, and the candle flickered wildly. Emma saw a ghostly figure taking shape, a man in an old fireman's uniform, his face lined with sorrow and fatigue. The apparition was transparent, but had a palpable presence that filled the room with a sense of despair. Emma took a deep breath and said, "Captain Wells, I've read about the fire and your heroic efforts. I know you're trying to communicate something. Please let me help you." The ghostly figure seemed to focus on Emma, and the room was filled with a soft, ethereal light. Captain Wells pointed towards the back of the bay, where an old, dusty locker stood partially hidden behind some equipment. Emma approached the locker and found it slightly ajar. Inside, she discovered an old, charred journal, Captain Wells' personal log from the night of the fire. Emma carefully removed the journal and began reading its pages. The entries detailed the harrowing events of that night, including Wells' efforts to save his crew and the realization that they were trapped. The final entries were heart-wrenching, with Wells expressing his love for his family and a desperate plea for forgiveness. The entries were filled with emotion and pain, revealing the depth of his sacrifice. As Emma read the diary aloud, the temperature in the room began to rise, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The ghostly figure of Captain Wells seemed to relax, and a sense of peace filled the space. The apparition nodded in gratitude before slowly fading away. The room warmed up, and the lights flickered back to their normal brightness. The next morning, Emma shared her experience with the other firefighters and showed them the journal. They were deeply moved by the discovery and decided to honor Captain Wells and the other fallen firefighters. They organized a memorial service at the station, dedicating a plaque to the brave men who had lost their lives. The once haunted Station 13 became a place of remembrance and respect. The eerie disturbances ceased, and the firehouse was no longer the subject of ghostly rumors. Emma's bravery and compassion had brought closure to Captain Wells' restless spirit and brought the community together in honor of those who had sacrificed so much. Emma's experience became a local legend, and she was celebrated for her courage in facing the unknown. Hawthorne Station 13, once a place of fear, now stood as a symbol of heroism, empathy, and the enduring legacy of those who serve selflessly. The firehouse, with its history of heroism and sacrifice, continued to stand as a beacon of hope and remembrance for all who walked through its doors. The dim, fluorescent lights of Station 7 flickered intermittently as Officer Julia Carter settled into her shift. It was a quiet evening in the small town of Ashton, and the police station, an old building dating back to the early 1900s, seemed to hum with an eerie silence. The station had a storied past and was known for its historical significance, having been the site of numerous investigations over the decades. Its creaky floors and musty smell were a testament to its age. Julia had recently transferred to Ashton from a larger city, seeking a slower pace and a fresh start. She was excited about the new role but couldn't shake the whispers of strange occurrences that had been shared by her new colleagues. The tales spoke of unexplained noises, shadowy figures, and unsettling incidents that had left many in the department feeling uneasy. As Julia began her shift, she found the station's usual suspects: old filing cabinets overflowing with case files, a cluttered desk, and a bulletin board adorned with photographs and crime reports. The station's layout was classic, with a front desk, a few offices, a holding cell, and a small break room. The walls were lined with aging wooden panels, and the station's history seemed to seep from every corner. The first few hours were uneventful. Julia caught up on paperwork and reviewed the day's reports. At around 10 p.m., she decided to check the holding cell, which had been recently renovated. The cell was empty, and everything appeared in order. She locked the door and headed back to her desk, but as she walked, she noticed something peculiar, a cold draft that seemed to follow her. Ignoring the chill, Julia continued her routine. But as the night wore on, strange occurrences began to unravel. The radio crackled with intermittent static, and she occasionally heard faint, indecipherable whispers coming from the break room. At first, Julia dismissed them as the effects of a long night, but the whispers grew more insistent. Around midnight, the station's main door creaked open, though Julia had locked it securely. She approached the door and saw no one outside. The hallway was empty, and the darkness seemed to thicken. Unease gnawed at her, but she reassured herself that it was merely a result of working late hours. Julia decided to investigate the source of the disturbances. She began with the break room, which was quiet but felt unusually cold. The windows were sealed tight, and the air seemed stagnant. She checked the appliances and found nothing out of place. The refrigerator hummed softly, but nothing else seemed amiss. Determined to find a rational explanation, Julia moved to the holding cell. The cold draft she had noticed earlier was stronger here, and the cell door rattled slightly as if something was trying to push it open. Julia checked the door's locks and found them secure. As she stood there, the lights flickered, and she heard a faint, mournful wail that seemed to come from within the walls. Julia's curiosity was piqued, and she decided to dig deeper. She found a dusty file cabinet in the corner of the station's basement, labeled Historical Cases. Inside, she discovered old case files and police reports from decades ago. Among them was a file marked Case 72, the disappearance of Thomas Gray. The file detailed the mysterious disappearance of Thomas Gray, a local man who had vanished in the 1950s. The case was one of the station's most puzzling. According to the file, Gray had been involved in a heated argument with a group of individuals known for their criminal activities. The last known sighting of him was near the station, and despite extensive searches, he was never found. Julia's eyes widened as she read through the report. The details were chilling. Thomas Gray had been last seen near the station's basement, and there were reports of strange noises and sightings of a shadowy figure around the time of his disappearance. The case had remained unsolved, and the file concluded with a note indicating that Gray's fate was unknown, but there were persistent rumors that he had been caught up in something sinister. As Julia read, she felt a shiver run down her spine. The lights in the basement flickered wildly, and the temperature plummeted. She heard a distinct, rhythmic tapping coming from behind a wall. Driven by a mixture of fear and determination, Julia followed the sound to a section of the basement that was sealed off. With great effort, she managed to pry open a small, hidden access panel. Behind it, she found an old, forgotten storage area. Inside, she discovered a small, dusty room with old furniture, a trunk, and scattered papers. The trunk was locked, but Julia found a key hidden among the papers. She unlocked the trunk and found a collection of old, faded photographs, personal letters, and a journal. The journal belonged to Thomas Gray and detailed his growing paranoia and fear of being followed. The entries described his attempts to escape from an unknown threat and his belief that he had been betrayed by someone close to him. Julia read the journal's final entry, which described a desperate plea for help and a final, chilling statement. "They are coming for me. I can hear them in the walls. I am trapped." As she finished reading, the room's temperature dropped even further, and the shadows seemed to grow darker. Julia felt a presence behind her, a cold, malevolent force. The lights flickered and then went out, plunging her into darkness. She heard the mournful wail again, louder and more urgent. Determined to bring closure to the case, Julia gathered the evidence and headed back to the main office. The whispers grew louder, and she felt as though she was being watched. She contacted the local authorities and requested backup, explaining the situation as best as she could. When the backup arrived, they searched the basement and the hidden room thoroughly. They found no additional evidence, but Julia's discovery provided new leads for the cold case. The journal and photographs were analyzed, and they revealed connections to a notorious criminal gang that had operated in the area during the 1950s. The case of Thomas Gray was reopened, and with the new evidence, investigators were able to make significant breakthroughs. The truth behind his disappearance was revealed, a tale of betrayal, deceit, and a tragic end that had haunted the station for decades. Julia's bravery and persistence had brought new light to an old mystery, and the eerie disturbances at Station 7 ceased. The once haunted police station became a place of renewed purpose and respect. Julia was commended for her courage and dedication, and the station's history was remembered with a new sense of reverence. The ghostly whispers and shadows that had once plagued Station 7 became a part of its storied past, and the building stood as a testament to the perseverance of those who seek justice and the enduring legacy of the truth. It was a warm summer evening when the group of friends, Emily, Jake, Sarah, and Tom, set off on what was supposed to be a relaxing camping trip. They had planned the outing for weeks, eager to escape the routine of city life and enjoy a weekend immersed in nature. The chosen campsite was deep within the dense forest of Maplewood, an area known for its serene beauty and rugged trails. Emily drove the group's old, reliable SUV, a rugged 4x4 vehicle well-suited for the rough terrain. As they drove through winding roads and over uneven paths, the forest closed in around them, the trees forming a canopy that dimmed the sunlight and cast long shadows. They laughed and joked as they navigated the rugged terrain, excited for the adventure ahead. After several hours of driving, they finally reached their campsite, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue over the landscape. They unloaded their gear and set up their tents, eager to settle in and enjoy the evening. As night fell, they gathered around a crackling campfire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The forest around them was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The air was cool and crisp, and the firelight danced on their faces as they reminisced about old times. After a while, Tom suggested they explore the nearby trails. He had heard about an old, abandoned cabin deeper in the forest that intrigued him. The group, feeling adventurous, agreed to go on a short hike to check it out. They grabbed their flashlights and set off, leaving the warmth of the campfire behind. The forest seemed different at night. The trees, once welcoming, now appeared to loom over them, their shadows stretching and shifting in the flickering beam of their flashlights. The air grew colder, and an unsettling quiet settled over the forest. Emily tried to shake off the feeling of being watched as they made their way down the trail. The hike was more challenging than they had anticipated. The path grew narrower, and the underbrush thickened. They occasionally stumbled over roots and rocks, but their excitement kept them moving forward. After about an hour, they reached the cabin, its silhouette barely visible against the darkening sky. The cabin was old and weather-beaten, with broken windows and a sagging roof. It looked as though it hadn't been used in decades. The group hesitated for a moment, the eerie stillness of the cabin making them uneasy. Tom, ever the adventurous one, pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The others followed, their flashlights illuminating the dust-covered interior. The cabin was a time capsule of sorts. Old furniture, long-forgotten toys, and yellowed newspapers were scattered throughout the space. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of decay. They wandered through the rooms, taking in the remnants of a bygone era. In the corner of one room, Emily discovered a small, old diary. She carefully opened it and began to read the entries aloud. The diary belonged to a woman named Eleanor, who had lived in the cabin during the early 1900s. The entries were filled with mundane details, but as Emily read further, the tone shifted. Eleanor began to write about strange occurrences, disembodied voices, unsettling dreams, and a growing sense of dread. As Emily read the final entry, which spoke of Eleanor's fear of something dark lurking in the forest, a chill ran down their spines. The entry ended abruptly with a cryptic note, "They are coming for me." Suddenly, the group heard a loud crash from outside. They froze, their flashlights casting erratic beams as they turned toward the sound. Jake cautiously approached the door and peered outside. The forest was shrouded in darkness, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. The unsettling feeling that had been growing all evening intensified. "Let's head back," Emily suggested, her voice trembling slightly. The others agreed, and they quickly made their way out of the cabin, eager to return to the safety of their campsite. The hike back was fraught with tension. The forest, which had seemed so inviting earlier, now felt hostile. The shadows were longer, and the air seemed thicker. They could hear strange rustlings and whispers that seemed to follow them as they walked. Each time they shone their flashlights in a different direction, the sound stopped, only to start again moments later. Just as they were nearing their campsite, the group noticed that the path had changed. The familiar landmarks were missing, and they found themselves disoriented. The forest, which had seemed so straightforward during the day, now felt like a maze with shifting boundaries. They retraced their steps, but the forest seemed to mock their efforts. Panic began to set in as they realized they were lost. The once clear trail was now obscured by thick fog that rolled in suddenly. The fog clung to the trees and the ground, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The whispers from the forest grew louder, and the unsettling feeling of being watched became overwhelming. Desperation drove them to call for help, but their phones had no signal. The eerie silence of the forest was occasionally broken by distant, inexplicable noises, something heavy moving through the underbrush, a faint, mournful cry, and the sound of something, or someone, breathing heavily nearby. As they stumbled through the fog, they heard a loud, growling sound that sent them into a frantic run. The fog parted briefly, revealing a shadowy figure in the distance. The figure was tall and indistinct, moving with a deliberate, menacing pace. The group ran faster, their hearts pounding in their chests. Eventually, they found a small clearing. Exhausted and terrified, they huddled together, trying to catch their breath. The shadowy figure had vanished, but the feeling of dread remained. The whispers in the forest seemed to grow louder, and the fog thickened again. Just as they were beginning to lose hope, they saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance. They shouted and waved, and the headlights grew brighter. A rescue team from the local search and rescue unit had been dispatched after their distress signal was picked up by a passing hiker. The rescuers guided them back to safety, and as they emerged from the forest, they looked back one last time. The fog began to lift, and the forest seemed to return to its natural state. The strange noises and shadows were gone, replaced by the serene, moonlit landscape. Back at the campsite, the group tried to make sense of the night's events. The diary and the cabin were left behind, as they felt they had no desire to return. The forest's enigmatic presence had left a deep impression on them. The once familiar wilderness had revealed a darker side, and the experience had changed them forever. As they drove away from the forest, the old SUV rumbled over the uneven terrain, and the memories of the night faded into the past. The forest stood silently behind them, a place of both beauty and mystery, a reminder that some places hold secrets that are best left undiscovered. The group's camping trip had ended in terror, but it also brought them closer together. They had faced their fears and survived an ordeal that would become a haunting tale they would share for years to come. The forest of Maplewood, with its shadows and whispers, remained a part of their lives, a testament to the thin boundary between the natural and the supernatural, and the enigmatic secrets hidden within the depths of the woods. Greenwood Park had always been a serene spot in the heart of the bustling city. With its sprawling lawns, towering oak trees, and picturesque pond, it was the perfect place for a peaceful afternoon or a leisurely stroll. The park was a favorite among locals for its jogging trails, picnic areas, and playgrounds. But beneath its seemingly idyllic surface, the park held a dark and unsettling secret. It was a crisp autumn evening when three friends, Lily, Mark, and Jenna, decided to take advantage of the beautiful weather and go for a late afternoon walk in the park. They had just finished their work and were eager to unwind before the sun set. The park was quiet, with only a few families scattered around and the occasional jogger making their way along the trails. The trio set off on one of the park's less traveled paths, a narrow trail that wound through a dense grove of trees. They chatted and laughed, enjoying the fresh air and the colorful fall foliage. As they ventured deeper into the grove, they noticed that the trail became less maintained. The leaves on the ground grew thicker, and the path was overgrown with brambles. After a while, they reached a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an old, decrepit gazebo. The structure had clearly seen better days. Its paint was peeling, and the wood was weathered and cracked. It looked like something from a bygone era, forgotten by time. Curious, Lily suggested they take a closer look. The others agreed, and they approached the gazebo. The moment they stepped inside, an odd sense of unease settled over them. The air felt colder, and the silence seemed to deepen. The gazebo's once ornate railings were now covered in layers of moss and grime. As they explored the gazebo, Jenna noticed something strange, a set of old, yellowed newspaper clippings pinned to the walls. The clippings were about various disappearances and mysterious incidents that had occurred in the park over the years. Each article was dated decades earlier, and the stories spoke of people vanishing without a trace and strange occurrences that had baffled the authorities. The articles were unsettling but fascinating. Mark began reading them aloud, and the trio became engrossed in the chilling details. The last clipping, however, was different. It was a handwritten note that read, "The shadows know. They are watching. Beware the dusk." As the sun began to set, the park took on a different character. The light grew dim, and the shadows from the trees lengthened and twisted. Lily glanced at her watch and realized that it was getting late. "Maybe we should head back," she suggested. The group agreed, and they started to make their way back to the main park area. However, the path they had taken seemed to have changed. The once clear trail was now obscured by thick, tangled undergrowth. The trees seemed to close in around them, and the familiar landmarks were nowhere to be seen. As they walked, they heard an odd rustling noise behind them, like footsteps following their every move. They turned around, but there was nothing there. The sound stopped whenever they stopped, only to start again when they continued walking. Unease grew into full-blown anxiety. Jenna suggested they use their phones to navigate back, but to their dismay, there was no signal. The forest around them grew darker, and the shadows became more pronounced. The whispers of the wind through the trees sounded almost like voices, murmuring unintelligibly. Mark shone his flashlight ahead, but the beam of light seemed to struggle against the encroaching darkness. The trees appeared to move and shift, as though the forest itself was alive and trying to trap them. The sense of disorientation intensified, and they began to panic. Suddenly, the rustling noise grew louder, and the shadows seemed to form into indistinct shapes. The figures were fleeting and elusive, just out of the reach of the flashlight's beam. Lily let out a frightened gasp as she saw a shadowy figure moving between the trees. It was tall and indistinct, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. The group quickened their pace, but the path continued to twist and turn in ways that defied logic. The once familiar park now felt like an alien landscape, a maze of shadows and fear. The shadows seemed to close in on them, whispering secrets and threats they couldn't understand. In their desperation, they stumbled upon a small, old stone monument hidden among the trees. The monument was weathered and covered in moss, with faded inscriptions that were barely legible. The words, "In memory of those lost," were etched into the stone, along with a date from over a century ago. The monument seemed to offer a brief respite from the oppressive atmosphere. They gathered around it, trying to catch their breath and calm their racing hearts. It was then that Lily noticed something strange, an old photograph lying near the base of the monument. The photo was black and white, showing a group of people standing in front of the very gazebo they had visited earlier. As she examined the photo, she realized that the people in the picture were the same as those described in the newspaper clippings. The photo seemed to radiate a sense of melancholy and foreboding. The realization hit them like a cold wave. There was a connection between the gazebo, the monument, and the disappearances described in the articles. Just as they were trying to piece together the clues, the forest seemed to come alive with movement. The shadowy figures grew bolder, their forms becoming more distinct and their presence more menacing. The whispers grew louder, and the once faint growls became more pronounced. With no other options, the group decided to make a desperate run for the main park area. They pushed through the darkness, their flashlight beams cutting through the oppressive gloom. The shadows seemed to reach out for them, and the forest itself seemed to conspire against their escape. The air grew colder, and the wind howled through the trees. The rustling and whispering intensified, creating an almost tangible sense of dread. The darkness seemed to press in on them, and the once clear paths became a labyrinth of fear. As they emerged from the tree-line, the familiar sights of the park came into view. The lights from the park's pathways and the distant sounds of people brought a sense of relief. They ran towards the park's main entrance, their breath coming in ragged gasps. When they finally reached the safety of the main area, they looked back at the forest. The park's beauty had returned, and the shadows had receded. The eerie atmosphere was gone, replaced by the serene, familiar landscape. The forest, with its secrets and shadows, seemed to have retreated, leaving them with a lingering sense of dread. The trio never spoke of their experience again. Greenwood Park, once a place of relaxation and enjoyment, now held a dark and unsettling memory for them. They couldn't explain what had happened, but the connection between the gazebo, the monument, and the shadows left an indelible mark on their minds. As the years passed, the park continued to be a popular destination for locals. The gazebo was eventually restored, and the monument remained a historical curiosity. However, the trio avoided the park at dusk and never ventured into the woods again. The shadowy figures and whispers in the forest became a part of their lives, a haunting reminder of the darkness that can hide behind even the most serene of facades. The park's history was marred by the mysterious disappearances and the eerie occurrences that had once plagued it. The friends knew that some places held secrets that were best left undisturbed, and Greenwood Park would forever remain a place of both beauty and fear.